a couple of minutes before you make it live. So like, send the. I don't know if you can you schedule a stream on Twitch.
I don't care, dude. It's not that big of a deal.
Okay.
It's not like I'm, you know, it's not like I'm gonna be doing this too much longer. Although I am gonna have a conversation with Ian McGilchrist, as I told you. I don't know if you know him too much.
Not really. I have no idea. Really. I did like a quick Google search when you sent us his name. I was like, oh, that's pretty interesting. But like, that's about it.
He's a big name. He's a big name. For me, anyways, he's one of the reasons why I became sort of. I'm gonna have to move that other box up. He's one of the reasons why I sort of started philosophy. So it's it's kind of nice. I've been waiting to talk to him for like the last 4 or 5 months. He actually had a conversation with Jordan Peterson. He was really nice to Jordan Peterson, man. I mean, like, I wouldn't be so nice to Jordan Peterson if I was probably talking to him, but you know, that's probably why I'm not talking to him.
I don't know. I probably would. I don't think Jordan Peterson's like all that bad. Like, I think that he's got some. I think that like the problems with Jordan Peterson are really inherited with the problems of Jung. But like I only really think that because I was reading a paper written by Jung, and he just started off with like we don't know why like basically how the mind and body are connected, but we must assume that like sorry how the body causes the mind, but we must assume that it does, and it just seems like wait a minute, why we're doing that? It just like just out of nowhere. But we must assume as well. That's the terms he used. And I was like, well, that's strong language, man, and very I think just philosophically ungrounded.
I'm sorry, I didn't hear the last part because I was trying to turn on my light. What is assumed by Jordan Peterson?
But it was by Jung. He assumes that the brain must cause the mind. I think I can't remember the exact terminology. It was that the brain must cause the mind. We're not. He basically says we're not sure how, but it must be assumed that the brain causes the mind. And it's like, right, why? and I think like one of the things in neuroscience, and I'm not one to like, I'm not a physicalist or anything like that, but it doesn't even seem to like necessarily match up with how we understand neuroscience anyway, because of brain plasticity and the cause effect relationship with thinking producing neurons and also neurons producing thinking. It seems to be a back and forth rather than a simple monodynamic causal relationship. But I mean that's even from a physicalist position. But I think it's something that Jordan Peterson kind of inherits, which is why he starts talking about like dopamine structures in the brain relating back to ancient ancient ancestors and how that's determining like how we engage with reality. And it's not to say that everything that he says is unjustified, because I think he points towards some pretty interesting concepts, like how rejection can lead to depression and stuff like that. But it can be explained without all of the physicalist baggage, but he just wants to throw it in there anyway, and then has to make loads of assumptions and then loads of characterizations, and then you end up with this like ideas of like dominance hierarchies and just shit that's just dumb, really, if I'm honest. But at the same time, I do appreciate the quite I see a lot of Nietzsche come through. I know that he's talking more about phenomenology. So like I don't know, like the guys went through a lot at the minute, and so maybe that's also enlightened them to maybe some different ways of approaching the subject. I don't know.
I wanted to give a quick shout out to Pickle for joining me here. I've always been on his stream, so hey Pickle, how you doing, buddy? I actually have 34 viewers out of nowhere. This is really surprising. But yeah, just what you said, just to kind of tailor the situation back to the stream and the audience, just so they know what you just said and we're talking about, if you don't mind me doing that real quick.
Yeah, no problem.
You're just basically saying that Jordan Peterson inherits like an epiphenomenalist view from Carl Jung. And the epiphenomenalist view is that if we were to look at causal activity with respect to the mind and body, causal activity would be completely causally closed off from the mind. So the mind isn't causally efficacious, but rather it's the body or the brain that's causally influencing the mind. and the mind has absolutely no causal capacity. As far as I kind of consider it, I think that one of the sort of qualifications of existing, and I'm not necessarily sold on this, but one of the types of qualifications of like to be or to exist, maybe not to be, but to exist, is that it's causally efficacious. And so if you remove the sort of notion of causality, I think, from the mind altogether, you kind of basically make it an abstraction, something that's not, doesn't, in my opinion, exist. It would be something like mathematical abstract numbers for some people, although I'm not also sold on the idea that mathematics is just sort of an abstraction either. I'm kind of more inclined towards Platonism of some sort, but I don't know, man. Yeah, I don't know if you could just presuppose the idea that the only thing that's causally efficacious is the brain itself. It just seems like a sort of byproduct of some form of materialism or some form of naturalism.
Yeah, the guy's taken a very much physicalist position, and I think even an evolutionary biological position, like more, even like more like confined than just pure physicalism. I don't think like, but I still think that he comes up like I think that the phenomenological influence on Jordan Peterson is still interesting. I still think that he makes some pretty good observations sometimes, but then I think this baggage usually. Like I don't. I think people underestimate how much metaphysics can genuinely impact one's rational endeavors. Like if like people seem to think that you can just engage in philosophy and neglect metaphysics and it won't make a difference, but metaphysics, and especially if we take like a Heideggerian account of something like an existential analysis, typically is understanding how we are thinking in the first place, and so why we are thinking in this way a lot of the time. And so when we're looking at like the meanings of words and how they relate to our understanding of like the overall structure of like Dasein and so on like that, in to use Heideggerian terms, we're actually analyzing why we are even having quote unquote these dopamine responses to our environment. We are actually understanding why we are having positive and negative responses in relation to something like rejection, and without presupposing some sort of naturalistic, end goal being reproduction or something like that. And I think that this is I think important to note, because I think if we were to take Jordan Peterson's position and then apply it to something like a monk who is actively engaged in something like celibacy, you would struggle to account for how that monk could achieve some manner of happiness without having to engage in the dominance hierarchy or whatever it is that he seems to think that individuals are engaged in. So I think that it also causes some issues, even like from a metaphysical position. It causes some ethical and political issues in his philosophy that usually ends up with them looking at the left, for example, as some sort of like evil, self-serving kind of beta male pursuit.
What do you mean exactly by a dominance hierarchy?
1 second there.
Sure.
All right, sorry. Well, I don't mean anything by it because I don't believe in them. But he references the dominance hierarchies in terms of well, this is strange. It seems to have to do with really recognition from a lot of the time from the other sex, from the opposite sex or sexual partners. But at the same time, he also seems to reference, kind of like almost a metaphysical issue of trying to overcome, like self-esteem issues and so on, like internally. So I'm not gonna lie, like in terms of Jordan Peterson's conception of the dominance hierarchy, it's probably something I'd ask him about, because I'm kind of, I don't think that he thinks it's atypical, like in the sense, like I don't think he's like, what's that channel on YouTube? I don't think he's like Charisma on Command or whatever that like basically like likes to make inferences about how if you can get what you want from people or anything like that. I think that what he usually references is one's like self-esteem and self-worth in relation to a social hierarchization in which certain people use they come towards relationships with certain virtuous characteristics and unvirtuous characteristics, like agreeableness, like and on the opposite side, disagreeableness. Um, Things like that really is what I would say. Like when he talks about the social hierarchy, it's kind of confusing for me to understand it because he puts it in terms which I think aren't very naturalistic, but then he always relates it to something like a lobster, or something that, or some sort of um, complex, like so you might reference like an Oedipal complex in someone like who's the guy? He does reference someone. Who's it? Thomas. Ooh, what's his name? I can't remember the guy's name, but he references someone having basically a narcissistic mother who develops an Oedipus complex, like a pretty severe Oedipus complex, because he's essentially been rejected and controlled his whole life. And then he relates this back to lobsters and their rejection in relation to dopogenic structures within the brain. Now, I'm just wondering how this, like, it seems that he wants to say that someone like Elliot Rodgers or something like that would be necessarily produced by a circumstance in which they see themselves as being lesser and their self-esteem as being lower in relationship to other people, who see themselves as more self-confident and more dominant, and so achieve their desires more easily.
Okay. I would have no idea how to comment on something like that. I haven't ever looked into Jordan Peterson's analysis of a dominance hierarchy. It seems kind of weird, though, to be honest with you. Yeah, I mean, I wouldn't know what to say there, Lewis.
Well, no, it's fine.
Yeah, but we should probably, I mean, if it's okay with you, I'd rather not probably talk about dominance hierarchy. I was kind of like, I was kind of more curious as what Jordan Peterson was saying on the moment, on the fly, than I was getting an analysis of Jordan Peter's philosophy or something like that.
Yeah, no, I just don't want to misrepresent the guy. I guess that's the only thing. But at the same time, I feel like it's hard to really pin him down. I mean, I've watched quite a bit of him, but
I still can't. I don't know if there is a metaphysics or an ontology of some sort. The last time I looked at him, and it was quite a while, it was like some sort of pragmatic theory of truth, but it was like a Jamesian version of it, and it was really a crude Jamesian version of it. Yeah, I mean, and then I can't even remember like what his ethics were. It seemed like he tittered on some sort of ethical realism, but seemed to subscribe like intuition pumps to basically make that work. But anyways, outside of that, have you been reading anything interesting?
Honestly, I've been researching economics more. Just getting into that, and also just doing a bit of epistemology, really. But like otherwise, I wouldn't say there's anything that I've necessarily done like a whole load of research into in order to understand. I'm mostly refreshing myself on epistemology. Trying to, with making the course and stuff, I'm just trying to make sure that I've delivered it in the right way and making sure that it's, coming across to people and so on. And then with economics, I'm debating destiny soon.
Again?
On socialist economics this time.
Okay.
I hadn't actually watched these, the Richard Wolff debate. I hadn't watched it. I've only just watched it.
I actually did watch it. It was actually fairly good. I like Richard Wolff's style. He's very straightforward, and I think he's like just basically wanting to fight for like fairly simple socialist policies throughout that entire debate. And I'm really not sure what was controversial about it. He was just basically saying like, look, we're in our economic structure right now is mostly capitalistic with a few socialist leaning policies. I want to make it more socialist leaning and a little bit less, or a minority of it being capitalistic and a majority of it being socialist leaning. And then he basically just, went over publicly owned companies within Europe, showed, like, okay, well, these are pretty successful. Why is it that we can't, basically do something like that within the United States? Seems as though not only do we have examples of that already working, but it's working on a large scale, predominantly in a lot of European countries. And then he keeps mentioning, like particularly I think Portugal as an example of what
the Mondragon.
Yeah.
Mondragon.
Yeah, yeah,
Yeah.
that was his example. Yeah, I couldn't remember the
Like
company.
he's correct and like they started to get like sassy between him and Destiny, and he's like, it's pronounced Mondragon, by the way. Like it's just like, ooh, that was a bit sassy. Um, yeah, like honestly, I thought it was interesting. I thought that the main contention was almost between it was like trying to watch like Plato. I described it before as like trying to watch like Plato debate Russell Brand. It doesn't. It was like it was a definite contention between academic discourse and online streamer.
Yeah, well,
It just they weren't even speaking anywhere akin to the same language. Like one of the big things is that in terms of economics, Destiny's like, give me a definition of socialism, and then obviously Richard Wolff being an academic, he has to nod to all of the primary discourse within this whole field, and he's like, look, it's a rich, diverse tradition. I can't just go, well, they're not socialists, I am, haha. Like that would be kind of wrong. And I think that one of the biggest problems in that debate is that Richard Wolff gives this, like this exposition on socialism.
mhm.
Um, Rather than mocking him, I think Destiny should have went, okay, so why do you choose the third option
Yeah.
over the first two and capitalism?
Mhm.
That would have been interesting. But like, rather than that, it was a very
I don't.
confrontation style.
Yeah, I don't know why Richard Wolff did that either, because if you look at some of his other YouTube videos, he basically says, like, look, this is my definition of socialism. It's not, big economy, sorry, not big economy, big government, where there's some sort of top-down influence of the government basically regulating the world or whatever, or the economy. I can't remember what his second definition was, but it was like a typical one that you hear on the internet. And he basically explicitly says, like, look, these aren't the definitions that I lay out. Instead, I have that third definition that he went on to, and he said, like, these are historically debated. I don't know why he even mentioned the first two. Honestly, he should have just gone for the third one, just dipped in completely, and just called it a day right there, and then just
It,
debated over that.
it
It was
was
like
it,
it was the problem that I have, and the biggest problem that I had, even with your last stream. I forgot what the guy that you debated recently, but it was
uh,
over also a lot of bullshit where he asked you to find everything. It's like as soon as a YouTube streamer asks you to find existence, being, reality, subjectivity, it's just game over. There's just nothing there. There's nothing going to ever be substantively done there because it's going to be a debate about semantics.
yeah,
And
it's literally, it's basically asking us to enter into an existential analysis on the spot, isn't it? What is existence? Oh my God. Uh, um, I think you're right there, but I think at the same time, with the Richard Wolff debate, I think that there's like, it's kind of like, look, I have a friend who's like an anarcho-capitalist figure, and he looks at it in terms of Austrian economics. And in Austrian economics, they understand socialism pretty much, from what I've gathered, to be anytime that the government interferes with the markets. So he doesn't even see himself as an anarcho-capitalist. He just sees himself as a capitalist. He thinks that anytime an individual recommends government interference, they are arguing for socialist policies. And so, in an economics debate, Richard Wolff's probably got to go, look, I'm aware that there is, the Austrian account. I'm aware of the neo-Keynesian and the neo-Keynesian account, and I'm also aware of but he has my market socialist account. And I think that he probably should have, as you say, just doubled down on his account and just went, look,
yeah, yeah,
we're going to ignore the first two. We're just going to ignore them. But I am aware that they're there. But I mean, that's something that you do in academia, isn't it? You have to kind of nod, knowing that there is these other two definitions. If you talk about socialism without having acknowledged that, then people just think, wow, this guy doesn't know what socialism is. Oh my God, has he never read anything? And they start sending him economics 101 books. And this is kind of the frustrating thing about it. Now, Destiny, I think, that, looking at this point, should have just went, rather than going, well, what do you take this to be? What do you take that to be? He should have just went, okay, okay, if we agree with your third definition of socialism, if that's what we're going to debate, why do you take that? And then the debate would have actually started. But we never actually really got into the debate, except for when Destiny's like saying that, like, for example, the Portuguese, the Portuguese corporation is not necessarily, what's the word? It's cooperatively owned, but it's not cooperatively run. and pointing out all these things. And I do think that they're actually fair points to make, by the way. I think that Destiny was making some fair points. I think that we never actually managed to get into it because by the time we even got this far, both of them fucking hated each other. So, and you could just feel the tension of like they both feel like they're both rhetorically they're in some sort of rhetorical game, and it has nothing to do with a genuine discussion anymore, because it feels like Richard Wolff feels like he's getting misrepresented, and Destiny feels like Richard Wolff is just monologuing and not actually engaging with the topic area. They're just speaking so differently that it just ended up so bad faith. It wasn't a train wreck. I don't want to say it was a train wreck. I think Vorsch got it wrong in his analysis, because I watched his analysis of the debate before I watched the debate, which put us off the debate at first, because he was saying like how bad Richard Wolff was, and how Richard Wolff he was saying like how Richard Wolff was like really angry, and how he was just like essentially like not really engaged in this sort of discussion and so on like that. But it's like, I'm not gonna lie, like there's no way that you would say that Richard Wolff's behavior was any worse than Destiny's. I mean, Destiny condescended him, calling him all the time condescendingly a professor. Like it was like watching debate bros, but this time there's like a professor involved. It was terrible. But at the same time, there was a lot of useful discourse. Like I think that, like I think you were saying that you found it interesting, those things that were brought up.
Yeah, it's been a little bit too long. It's been about 4 or 3 months. Like I saw it when it basically came out the day after, so I can't remember too many details on it, other than I obviously agreed with a lot of Richard Wolff's points. I remember there being some outside of the pedanticism. It seemed like Destiny was sort of like disagreeing with like small, minute philosophical points that I think could have really helped clarify things. Like, for example, Richard Wolff said something along the lines, and I think it was actually fairly astute and subtle, that a definition is only you can only define something in virtue of its sort of negative relation to other types of definitions.
Yeah, I like that as well. Yeah.
And it's just like, so a dog is going to be defined by a not cat. It's like, it's basically this sort of structuralist conceptualization of like semantical meanings, right?
Yeah, I completely agree with that as well. Like, and
yeah, it's just like, and it's just like, and then Destiny is just said something along the lines of,
that's not how it works.
no, it's not how it works. Like, no, of course we don't think, like, when we think of dog, we don't just automatically think of cat, blah, blah, blah. But you kind of do. You don't, honestly, you're not aware of, it having these certain types of negations to it, but a definition is only possible with a limit. Because if it's unlimited. Because if it's unlimited, right, then it's just a vacuous semantic. Yeah, it just has vacuous semantic content. It's indeterminate, right? And
let's be honest. This has been in philosophy since at least since Aquinas, and I think it was even in Aristotle actually. Like the idea of a privation being the necessary component for something being itself in the first place. It must contain to be like one of in Aquinas, he puts it as like it must also contain not being in order to exist. So it has to have some sort of lack, because the only thing that's perfectly actual is God. I think that in terms of Aristotle, it's like when he talks about like potentiality, like potency. Obviously, a seed must not be a tree, but have the potentiality to become a tree. Like in the possibility of completion. All of this requires like the notion that the point of time and the engagement with the concept of time and the development and so on in the first place. But it also contains, just even as you say, and I think Hegel really hammers down on this when we talk about determinate objects. To create a determinate object is to annihilate the totality of our or the unity of our experience. At first, we must isolate an aspect of our experience away from everything else, and I think that's like obvious. Like if I point at something and say camera, I'm obliterating all of the unified possibility of experience in order for me to give you that description.
Yeah, sure, yeah. On that note, actually, I wanted to present an idea, I guess. I wanted to kind of an idea that I've been recently thinking about, and I have John to thank for this one again. John, who is Shout out to John again for always giving me these crazy good ideas, and this one's related to free will, and it's going to be about libertarian free will, which is just basically freedom from previous antecedent conditions and freedom from deterministic restraints. But since we kind of went on to the idea that every single type of thing, every type of definition includes its negation, I kind of wanted to push back on that a little bit with the idea of a type of free will that I think that we might have. And I wanted to pull out the concept of the liberty of indifference. Have you heard of it before?
I haven't actually, no.
It's sort of interesting. So I'm going to try to relate this to ethics, to action theory, and free will. So how we make actions, how they relate to our free will, and how they relate to morality. Because I think that by acting ethically, we partake in a certain type of reasoning capacity that is in a way divorced from other types of value systems, which might then subject us to those types of value systems, namely the passions, right? So I know you kind of like to go against the sort of Humean account.
That just sounded like, I'm not gonna lie, was that just Plato? I felt like I just felt like I just felt the ghost of Plato.
Maybe. Well, I don't know. I mean, Plato I think is one of the hardest.
I heard the word partake, and I heard
partake in the
a rejection of the passions, and then that's that might just sound like it's Plato here.
So I want to qualify that. I've been trying to be a little bit more careful with my words. When I say reject the passions, I mean that there is something irreducible about our judgments and our beliefs and our actions that cannot be reduced to the passions alone. But they're going to include the passions or our desires in some sort of sense, but in a more refined sense. And this is actually more Kantian. I think this is more Kantian than anything, because I've been kind of reading a little bit more about Kant's ethics. I've been reading Alan Wood and Henry Allison's account of Kant's ethics, and they actually have a pretty good refined account. So I mean, like, people generally have this sort of misconception on Kant. Actually, it was a misconception that I had recently. He also claimed that Alistair McIntyre had this misconception, brutal misconception, actually, that can sort of really, I think, delegitimize all of Kant's ethics if we take it this way. But, and then I'll briefly say that, and then I'll get into the issue of free will real quick. So, like, the misconception is that ethical performances or doing ethical actions in Kant's theory, the deontological theory, means doing one's duty. And duty and the good are basically synonymous terms. And this is according to McIntyre's interpretation of Kant. So the only act that's actually ethical is one that's done of duty. And that's actually turns out to be a sort of misconception, I think, according to Alan Wood and Henry Allison of Kant's ethics. He actually, and it was one of Schiller's arguments against Kant, actually, 200 years ago or so. So the idea isn't that only duty and doing things for duty's sake is ethical. It's rather that doing things for duty's sake is what gives it reverence. Like, you can basically esteem the person who does things out of duty. Not that if they happen to do something via duty, and if they did it out of desire, and it happened to correspond to something that is morally obligatory, that is still a good action. It's just not one that we would esteem. But nonetheless, if you do an action that's good, even though you don't intend to do it, it would still be good. However,
I don't know if I agree, because I know that Kant says, like, I think was it the only thing that is good is goodwill. Unqualifiably good is goodwill.
Right.
Which seems to point to me the idea that the good is the intentional state within the agent.
Yeah. So that's the entire debate. It's whether the goodwill is synonymous to duty. And that's exactly what is under question, is that if Kant lines up with acts of virtue, and sometimes we do act virtuous, then those could be one of the goodwill. It just doesn't have to be necessarily one out of duty's sake, for the sake of duty all the time. That's just basically that they're saying that there's a sort of broadness, a semantic range for the notion of the goodwill that's greater than the semantic range of duty itself. So one can do good acts, but they are not necessarily ones of duty. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I suppose. I mean, like, I think that that would be fair, because I think that like you could say that like but then I'm not sure. I'm not sure how I would necessarily. I mean, like, I don't think I could necessarily comment on whether that was right or wrong. More than my understanding of Kant would be to say that, when we talk about duty for duty's sake, he relates this to a notion of doing, for willing the good for the sake of itself, and that would be obviously my interpretation of Kant.
Well,
If you were to,
the idea is like, let's say that you are doing a good action, and I think this one will kind of run it home. Let's say that you do a good action, and let's say the good action is helping your friend with their debt, and or helping your friend doing whatever, and you have a desire to do that. Incidentally, that desire is also good. Now, you wouldn't say that just because you desired to do the good and you did it for desiring's sake, that your will wasn't good, right? You would say, no, your desire was good, your will was good. Your will was good, but you didn't necessarily do it for duty's sake, right? You did it because you had a good will and because you desired it. That could still be a portion of the goodwill, but it doesn't have to necessarily be something that you act out of duty. Now, you can do something for duty's sake, and that would give you esteem, but it doesn't necessarily have to be necessarily for duty's sake. You just happen to do also something that's good at that moment. So, I mean, one of Schiller's criticisms of Kant is that, I wish I could go do some activities with my friends this morning, do some good activities with my friends because I desire it, but alas, I can't. The duty, the goodwill doesn't allow me to do that. That's a sort of what Alan Wood and Allison think is a sort of bad interpretation of Kant. Is that when
Kant is the barbarian, isn't he?
Right. They're basically saying like a virtue-esque dispositional character can't be considered good because it's not in accordance to duty all the time. But he's saying you don't necessarily need to be in accordance with duty. You just need to be in accordance with the goodwill. So good reasoning is sufficient enough for that. And that's, I mean, this is just...
Good reasoning. I mean, this is kind of the weird thing, because Kant seems to think that good reasoning leads to to the conception of our duties, though, doesn't he? So it's kind of like, maybe he's saying like a shortcut to understanding the duty is the categorical imperative, but it's not necessarily the only way that we could come to the conclusion that something is good. So you could will something that was good without having gone through the categorical imperative by making simply like by choosing another epistemological like methodology, maybe.
Right. Yes, but that would still be doing something out of a goodwill, according to Alan Wood.
Well, I think that's fair. I think that would be like a fair interpretation. I mean, like, obviously, I don't take the Schiller's criticism of Kant necessarily to be like a defining blow. I think I think Schiller, although he's got some very interesting points, I actually really do like Schiller, and he's one of the most interesting philosophers I think you could probably pick up. And he's like, the aesthetic education of man, and the idea like of the barbarian in this case being the Kantian kind of pure intellectual approach to human life versus the cold intellectual approach to human life versus the savage, which is the purely emotional, uninhibited, desirous approach to life, and how they need to be essentially made to be unified in what it means to be human. I think is a really interesting take, and I think essentially tries to, I think, does something similar to what Nietzsche is trying to do in so maybe The Birth of Tragedy. There is Apollo and there is also Dionysus. We can't really neglect both aspects of ourselves, and I get that, and I think it's also something that maybe Hegel's trying to do. But obviously, I always take the Hegelian critique of Kant to be perhaps the one that I find most convincing, which is really just talking about necessarily how we have developed and how we understand ourselves in relation to the world around us in the first place, to be characteristically what we must rely upon, rather than something that is something so abstract as the goodwill. It's like I don't think Hegel even disagrees with the idea of the goodwill being good. He's just like, well, it's just an empty formulation. Um, tell me what the hell you mean by that, because I don't know if you know how to apply it. I would say that was probably the most I would say the best critique of Kant. It's not even denying the epistemological, like, or even the epistemological power of Kant's position. It's rather just saying that, look, you know, Kant is pretty much right. I just don't have it's just meaningless. It's like, yeah, it's total, it's true, but it's a truism. You know.
I'm not sure if you're talking about. Are you talking about the empty formalist objection?
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah, I'm not sure how I feel about that. I mean, I kind of prescribe myself to the three formulas that Kant has, and maybe I can't remember if there was a fourth formula if we include the political one about right. I forgot what the name of that one was, but they all seem completely fine to me, because that's exactly what they're supposed to be. They're supposed to be forms, abstract sort of. I'm not even sure if they're abstract. I think using the term abstract can kind of lead us astray when we're reading with Kant. But there are supposed to be forms that are supposed to be divorced from content, because the content has to be particular and the forms have to be universal. So it seems completely fine to have certain types of formulations. One of the formulations is just universalizability. I can't really conceive of an ethics that doesn't universalize a set of rules, right? Because then it would just be exclusively dealing with just particulars all the time.
I think Hegel gives us the reason why we universalize in the first place, because it's almost as if the conception of self is we're not coming from a particular account in the first place. We are already coming from a universal account and attempting to apply it to a particular when we talk about what the self actually is and how we are approaching our desires and how reason approaches, you know, the system of drives. And I think that when you look at it like this, then you start to see why we ought to universalize. We universalize primarily because our understanding of self is universal, applied to, well, I wouldn't necessarily say particular, because I'm kind of contentious on that word of whether a particular exists or whether it's just an individual universal, or an individual, what's the word I'm looking for?
I don't know if okay, yeah, I'm not sure what universal individual is, but
so it's kind of like an instancing of a universal rather than a particular.
Okay, sure, yeah. I mean,
I would probably lie on that, because I think that I'll probably lie with that in terms of the debate, in terms of Aristotle as well, with the same sort of thing. But I think it makes very little difference for the debate necessarily, other than maybe its application here. Because if we take us to come from, let's say, an internal egoistic account in which we can have some sort of a priori, engagement with the world as being given by, you know, some sort of necessary condition from which we have been, like, essentially we apply simply to have an experience, like even like some sort of transcendental condition. This could, in theory, form the necessary conditions for our engagement in ethics. But I think that what Hegel's trying to show is that these conditions are produced by language and our engagement with the language and our engagement with conceptualization, which is not individualistic, but in terms of a group dynamic. And so when we talk about universalization, we talk about universalization not because we are trying to work out, like, well, what do you think, what do I think, and it's not just purely epistemological, it's metaphysical. Its application only makes sense as when we universalize it, because without understanding it as a universal, we've lost we've lost what it actually is. And I think Hegel talks about this even in terms of the application of words. When I create a word, I don't instance from a particular and say, look, this is now a table, and that's how I create a word. I now create a logical connection between multiple experiences that individuals are actually capable of experiencing, and all possible experiences from that. And so when we look at something being universalized, I'm actually referencing how I construct the experiences, including the ethical experiences I have in day-to-day life.
Yeah, actually, hold that thought just for a second. One of my friend had a pretty good way of basically putting it. A universal instantiated. He had 4 categories, and basically he said that universals instantiated in the particular have the, the property of repeatability. So I agree with you there. Um, hold that thought. I did want to get back to the topic of free will, and I wanted to run through the liberty of indifference with you.
Someone's just knocked on my door, so I'll be 2 seconds.
What's that?
Someone's just knocked on my door. I'll be 2 seconds.
Okay, sure, yeah. Hmm. So I wanted to go over the liberty of indifference with Lewis real quick.
I am back.
Okay,
Oop.
cool. Yeah. Um. Okay, so yeah, so there's so I think I'm pretty sure we agree maybe on some aspects of free will. I can't remember if you're a libertarian or not. Like, are you or?
I think that the question, like, if I'm honest, I think I've actually, funnily enough, got a book that I really recommend to everyone, which is Free Will and Continental Philosophy. And I think that the way that we approach the question of the problem of free will is the problem. I think that trying to see it in terms of the causal language of science has pretty much caused the issue, first of all, like where we have already presupposed like a causal relationship in which is like try to understand that the individual is caused by something rather than and perhaps an existential relationship. And I think if you look at something like existentialism, it's not to presuppose some sort of metaphysical libertarianism, but it's to say that both metaphysics, epistemology, and all of our fields from that point are only made possible because of human engagement, and I think it really comes down to the Lupin problem that psychology seems to create, which is I create a theory of mind, which then in my understanding of this theory of mind changes how I think, and so now the theory of mind is no longer applicable. And I think that in terms of trying to look for some sort of or in terms of like physical sense, in the physical sense, that the construction of objects as being causal, as causing ourselves, forgets the relationship between the individual actually constructing the object in the first place. So in my characterization of the object, I am the production of objectification. I objectify the world. The world is like my responsibility in almost like a Sartrean. I think that's almost a Sartrean quote. So when I approach free will, I'm definitely one I believe in free will. Would I say I'm a libertarian? I mean, it's probably one of the closest position I would have, or in terms of the typical descriptions, but I'm not a fan of them necessarily. If that's any explanation.
Okay. I think the types of questions that I'm going to ask are a little bit orthogonal to that. So the liberty of indifference is just basically, given that you have multiple choices, just, we can be crude about it, A, B, C, D, is that regardless of me having some sort of antecedent value attributed to B or C, let's say the value of B was actually greater, but I had more incentive to do, more prior antecedent incentive to do B, I could still do A regardless, even though that I have more value. So the way that a lot of people sort of present the idea, I think, really crudely is like that, right? If I have A and B, and I prefer B, I'll do B in just about any sort of circumstance. And not only that, but when I contemplate my actions, right, I contemplate in virtue of A, and then I contemplate B and C and so forth. What I'm about to suggest is that we don't even need to contemplate these alternative choices, and that we can actually be sort of indifferent to these choices, and we can ultimately choose certain types of things that we value, that we value less than others. And this is to sort of, I think, get us to be able to ground certain forms of ethics. So the question is that if, and I could ask you this question, maybe you have an answer to it, if there is a categorical reason to do A, that is that there's an ethical reason, an obligation to do A, and there's not one to do B, let's say it's in self-interest, there's at least some situations of where I do in self-interest choose over categorical reasons. And if that's the case, it doesn't seem like the choice A then does have a categorical push. Why is it that if it does have a categorical push, I don't immediately do it if it's always ethically necessary? And yeah, go ahead. Yeah, if you have an answer to that, go ahead, and then I'll kind of, chip in.
Well, if I'm honest, I would say that freedom is reason, and I would say that we are only free when we do choose the categorical reason. When I choose to act on a, let's say, self-interest or something like that, I do it in relation to perhaps a different form of either normativity or yeah, like usually like maybe it's a perverse form of normativity from which I haven't chosen. And I can even be unconscious to this. This can be like an unconscious bias towards certain conditions.
There's going to be immediate problems, I think, if we get into dispositional tendencies to why I chose B over A. Let's not focus on dispositional tendencies. Those might not even be actions at all.
Well, this is the thing.
I also think there's a big problem with you saying things like only ethical actions or choices. I think I had that kind of view. Now I don't think you have to prescribe to the idea that when I make the choice to eat ice cream or whatever, that's not a free action.
You see, I'm of the view that all actions are ethical anyway. It's not. I mean, like whether that we're right or wrong on them. It's more of the fact, like, I have chosen this, and I've chosen this because I believe that I'm correct in some sort of conception. It may turn out that so for example, in my engagement with the categorical versus this other position, self-interestedness, I've at that point understood the world in relationship to a means end scenario in which I have created a value or in which I've ordered my desires in relation to a value transaction with my committing action A and my committing action B as leading to a consequence which I value to a greater degree.
See, that's exactly what I want to push back on right here. with the liberty of indifference. So I would say that when we're making a certain type of action, that via choosing that action, whatever it may be, I don't have to contemplate the alternative possibilities or alternative possibilities. So here's the thing. Some people think that, and this is, in classic sort of debates, I think with, what's his name? Ah, God, who's the guy that made the consequence argument? For some reason, Van Inwagen, right? So he makes this sort of idea that, okay, well, if we have some sort of libertarian free will, like why I choose, I'm choosing A right here, there has to be a reason why I'm choosing A over B. And if there is no antecedent reason why I'm choosing A over B, that's not a free choice, right? What I'm saying is that just because we don't have a reason why we choose A over B doesn't mean that we don't have a reason simpliciter. And I think this is what sort of goes over people's head often. So say I have a moral obligation to do something, and then let's say that that moral obligation involves me swimming, and I really hate water, and I really don't like that person, and there might be a lot of antecedent conditions which really make it sort of unvaluable to me, to where I typically wouldn't do it under any circumstances. But I still do the action of saving that person, say if they're drowning, despite those antecedent conditions. It's not because necessarily I value A over B more. It's just that I chose just to do A in that scenario. And if a person was to ask me, well, sure, okay, you chose A, but why did you choose A over B? You just say, well, I don't have a reason why I chose A over B, but that doesn't illegitimately make that action one not a free will. And the reason but hold on, and the sort of caveat there is that well, that seems like you did it arbitrarily, but no, we have a sort of liberty of indifference to not contemplate B or C or D. Often, when we make a choice, I'm not contemplating various legitimate and valuable options that if I did start, contemplating it, I might do those instead. So, for example, I might really value eating a chocolate ice cream cone while this person is drowning, but I don't contemplate that, right? I'm indifferent to that type of possibility, and so I don't start thinking about B or C or D. I just do A. The sort of categoricity pulls me in a way to affirm that reasoning, and that reasoning sort of then launches me to action. I never needed to contemplate these sort of other types of possibilities of which I could be indifferent to. So, and then furthermore, I do think that we have a reason for why we did A. But we had no reason why we did A over B. And often we don't have a reason for why we did A over B over C, or, why I chose not to, go to the moon or whatever. I obviously didn't contemplate those types of things at that point.
Yeah, and I would agree with that to some degree, but I think the difference is whether you are being pulled in alternative directions.
No. I'm saying like you're not being pulled in alternative directions.
Oh yeah,
right?
yeah.
You don't have to be pulled in alternative directions. You just see the categorical force. All that matters, I think, at this scenario is what I'm saying, is the categorical force of the action itself. And you are indifferent to all of the subjective values that have antecedently motivated you prior to hand. So here I'm I'm making a radical point here, is basically saying that prior deterministic conditions have nothing to do with it. The categoricity actually sort of begins to causally layer over all those prior antecedent conditions, and I just choose at that moment for that. And it's a brute fact, of course, why I did it over B, but it's not a brute fact of why I did it simpliciter. I still had a reason for it. And as long as I think we have a reason for it, we're still giving it an explanation. We're just not giving it an explanation for why we did it over other reasons. And that might be, I think, legitimate.
We see, this is the thing. I would say that in terms of having a reason for it, I would agree. I would say that the only times that we would have to give a reason why we chose A over B is if we had already came to a point of conflict within ourselves, which meant that something within our normativity came to the like, so for example, at that point in which you were witnessing someone drown, you were like, fuck, I don't want to jump in that pool, and you contemplated for a second, not jumping in the pool. And the only reason that you would do that is if there was a competing form of normativity within yourself in a kind of, and this is why I was saying in terms of drives, because I think that we can have drives that we're not conscious of, and there can be times, obviously, when there aren't competing drives.
No, but that's just so here I'm taking a very Kantian point, and when you say drives, you begin to get into psychological points, motivations, inclinations. When I think the basis of ethics for Kant is going to be transcendental, which is going to be non-empirical, right? It's not going to be based upon certain types of events in the world which are antecedent, which pull me and tug me a certain type of way. I'm saying that there's no contradiction in just basically saying, I didn't contemplate anything else at that point. I immediately knew what to do. The reason that was granted to me came within. It motivated me. So there's some level of desire to do it, but it's a desire to do things out of reason and out of ethical compulsion and duty. And then I did it. I didn't have to battle myself out. That's not to say I never battle myself out, or I'm never in competing modes of reasoning. Sometimes there might be cases of where I reason about different types of things, or I might compete against different types of things. But I'm suggesting two things: is that sometimes that doesn't happen and we just do the good, or sometimes, despite me valuing other things more, like not getting myself wet to save someone, I'm indifferent to those types of things. And I think I think that's a kind of a radical thesis, because you look at someone like Daniel Dennett, and he basically says, if you look at one of the it's not an SCP article, it's a philosophy article, he's like, the liberty of indifference is not even worth considering as a form of free will that can be achievable.
Well, I'm not gonna lie, I think I probably disagree with that in some respects, because I think that one, I would take the Kantian position, like, obviously I know that you're saying it comes within yourself, but the fact that it comes within yourself is only synthesized within experience, and that experience is in relation to alternative modes of action from which an individual is engaging with. And so, like, there might be, don't get me wrong, even like, so if we take someone like Murdoch or something like that, we could already have preconceived value responses built into our perceptions where we actually see the reasons. I would allow for that. Like, you don't necessarily have to contemplate it because you've already contemplated it in constructing the world around you. It is already like
that's I'm not saying that you didn't need to. Let's say that the point is that at some point you're going to have to gain knowledge or insight into some sort of ethical, I don't want to say belief, or have some sort of practical cognition that can't be grounded in further empirical matters, because then we're just going to get into sentimental theories. We're going to basically say certain types of things like, I don't know, like, my ethics is going to be grounded in some sort of empirical state of affairs. I'm not denying that you need experience in order to get at ethics. I'm saying it's going to be independent of those ethics. And I'm not saying that there wouldn't be a prior inferential chain of ethical reasoning, but I am saying that that ethical chain of inferential reasoning is not going to be based upon some sort of like Humean forms of desire or incentive for passions.
I don't think that necessarily have to take the Humean point of motivation. I would 100% agree with you there.
I'm saying that we could do things for facts of reason alone. Facts of reason.
This is the thing. I think that the only way that it makes sense is in its that when these a priori conceptions of value are synthesized within an agent's experience of value, and so when
what do you mean by synthesize? What does experience offer? What could experience possibly offer in terms of giving categoricity or weight to what we ought to do?
I would say that what we ought to do, it gives us I would say that it gives us the experience of having skin in the game, of having interests. It gives us the very notion of value from which ethics is even engaged within. And I do think that that would be open to Schiller's critique. It would be like when you can have like a rational pursuit which is going for a given end which is arbitrarily selected, rather than a rational pursuit which is grounded in the nature, well, not necessarily the nature, but the experience of the agent. And I would say that necessarily is not applicable to Kant, because I would say that Kant if understood through like maybe a Hegelian lens, understands the synthesis to be in the life of the individual, experiencing the a priori conception of value from which they are actually engaged in terms of normativity. Like they're engaged in conceiving of different ethical alternatives, but they're doing that because they understand that ethics and behavior are in relation to our subjective experiences in the world.
Well, no one's denying that we need experiences in order to experience things, or in order to be able to partake in ethics, right? I mean, this is written in the very first few pages in the Critique of Pure Reason.
Is happiness. Was it the end of all the end of all rational men is happiness? I think he writes.
The ends of all rational men is happiness. I mean, his ethical theories were explicitly against the idea that we need to achieve ends towards just happiness. Oh, Hegel.
He never said, no. That was Kant. Like Kant actually wrote. I think it's in the Metaphysics of Morals. The end of all rational happiness is the end of all rational men.
Maybe, but that wouldn't be in. But he's also against the. How do you pronounce it again? Eudaimonianist versions of morality, which would have included virtue theory as a whole, and like British forms of like morality, which also at that time had basically happiness as a sort of consequence that we should achieve. You know, certain types of consequentialist theories which aim for happiness. He was explicitly against those. I mean, like his ethical theories had very little to do with like achieving happiness, right? Because I mean, we're going to obviously conflict in terms of what is going to be given, like which types of ends are going to give the greatest amount of happiness depending upon the person. So that's not gonna be able to. I'm not sure if that's gonna be able to.
I don't think that's what he was necessarily saying. I think that what he was trying to, and I mean I could be wrong in this. I wouldn't call myself like an expert on Kant, but I would say that what he was trying to show is the a priori synthetic nature of ethics. That when we engage, it's not that we experience the value itself. It's self-evident. It cannot be denied. We can deduce values in terms of in terms of the possible values, but in our experience of them, do we see that these values are what these values are? It's like it's like understanding the geometry of a triangle whilst also experiencing a triangle in real life in our practical reasoning. And I think that's probably where I would take the Kantian position. And I also would say that like if we apply this like sort of indifference, I would say that like, what happens when we are indifferent to something from which is compulsive. So when we engage in compulsive behavior, but do not seek to test it. Like I would say like this happens with neurotic people all the time. Like I have OCD, and there has been times when without even contemplating the action, I've engaged in a compulsion, like I wash me hands or something like that.
It depends if we're doing that for reasons or just dispositional urges. If it's the latter, and if it's completely dispositional, right, then I wouldn't say that that's an action. If it's part and part, which most of our actions are, I think, then it's going to probably be done of reasons.
Yes, but
we can do unethical reasons. Kant explicitly says that we can, I think, do actions that are unethical, and there still be actions in some sort of sense. But he's basically saying that there's even a step further than that. Is that our ethical actions, the ones of categorical nature, of the sui generis type, they're unique in themselves, and I think especially because they have this type of category to them, namely categoricity, that they have a certain type of tendency of where we can just choose to do that for no reason other than just to choose that, right? It would be completely arbitrary for why we chose A over B. But what my question is, I want to hit you with this. There's no logical contradiction as far as I can tell with what I'm offering right here as a possible explanation for our actions. Not only that, but it gets past this sort of idea. Okay, well, I chose I chose to do A over B for no reason, right? Because if I had a reason, then it wouldn't be unconditional, it wouldn't be categorical, it would be based upon some sort of empirical event. That empirical event would lead to another empirical event. We'd get ourselves back to the consequence argument, right? So either something has to terminate in a foundation or it's a brute fact. But I'm saying it's neither a foundationalist explanation, maybe kind of, and it's not a brute fact. It's based upon a reason, but what is kind of a brute fact is its relation to other types of possibilities. There, I'm just saying we don't need to contemplate alternative possibilities. We can just be indifferent to those.
You see, I understand what you're saying. Like the idea of just being, we don't have to and I think that is fine. Like as in we could just simply have a normativity that is running through us. That doesn't mean that we have to go like, oh well, I chose it for like. So for example,
well, yeah, I mean that is if it is constitutive, right? If morality is constitutive of reason.
Like so I get that like like there is like one like that in this case there is I would say like the reason I would relate it back to drives is because I would see drives. You see, I think you see drives in the Humean sort of passion motivational sense. When I'm taking, or even a Platonic separation between the drives and reason, I see drives as being sublimated through the normativity of our society to even become an intelligible choice to the agent. When I am motivated to choose between A and B, it is presented itself as a choice from which is intelligible to me, and in that I am now given I now must weigh up two, alternative forms of reasoning. Do I wash my hands or do I not wash my hands in relation to the motivational states that I am experiencing?
Okay, well then, okay, so let's run through it. Why do you choose A over B? And you'll say it's because I was disposed to it. Why were you disposed to it?
Well, this is the thing. I would say, like, I wouldn't necessarily say I was disposed to it. I would say that I chose A over B, in relation to my and I would say overall it was, so I would say I'd point out consequences. Those consequences, you say, oh, why do I care about those consequences? I'd say that it relates to the expression of my subjectivity from which I am inherently trying to achieve. Okay. And that in these consequences, in conceiving reality in a certain way, I have chosen to give meaning to a set of possibilities or a series of actions over the other.
Yeah, but then you are dependent upon the antecedent conditions, and you'd be a compatibilist.
I mean, like, this is the thing. I think that this is the thing. Like, I mean, how am I a compatibilist in this? In what way? I mean, don't get me wrong. I used to consider myself a compatibilist.
Yeah, so. I mean, you're looking at, first of all, you're looking at consequences instead of intent. So you're not a deontologist. Just okay. Look. So you're looking. No,
I'm looking at the expression of subjectivity, which is a priori, and that in attempting to express my subjectivity, it is done within relation to the world in which I exist, being here. And in that world, there is a series of possible meanings from which I can engage with. And so I'm understanding myself to be both a chooser existentially, whilst also being confined to the limits of language, and my ability to conceive of rational alternatives.
Yeah, but that just skips over the question that I asked you. I understand that language is a sort of public activity that in our subjectivity is going to be based upon other minds, and of course you can only constitute your interest through the interests of others. But this is the sort of thing I don't know too much about. I mean, I haven't looked into it. This still doesn't get you far enough, I think, because all you're going to end up basically saying there is that ethics is going to be some sort of public, communitarian conversation that we still have to agree upon in some sort of way. Like the standards of that normativity are going to not be based upon any sort of subject, but they're going to be based on some sort of agreement and how we experience the world, and we're all going to be interacting with each other, whatever. Like that's, and those are still going to be conditions based upon antecedent conditions before those. And we're back into the consequence argument of how we can be morally responsible for something. That...
I mean, the very bedrock of this. I'm gonna hit indeterminacy and existentialism. Like, if you push me very to the base, if you go like, why is someone engaged in this in the first place? I'd be like at the end of the day, like I'm gonna hit the point in which I go, we exist. That is the foundation from which normativity is based on the first place, and my engagement within reason and language was the precondition of choice, which is the expression of my subjectivity in the first place. I have chosen to engage in rationality and reason, and in my endorsement of reasons, I am actively using my faculties to try and work out which is the right, and rather than saying,
yeah, so you said I have chosen to partake within reason. See, I think that sort of works the opposite way. You have reason, and then you sort of partake in reason instead of necessarily choosing to partake in reason. Now, of course, there's of course a historical, there's of course a historical development of human reasoning, right? I mean, we're children at one point, and we have to develop these types of norms. We develop certain types of ethics, and in that sense, we're kind of bound to, our history and whatever. And in that sense, we're sort of bound to determinism. The point is that once we achieve the capacities of human reasoning, that's something that we don't choose. We're opted in it, but once we have it, there, I think we have some capacity of libertarian free will. Or if we want to just kind of get rid of this notion of libertarian free will and at least focus on what I was saying earlier, that is freedom from the types of empirical constraints that are offered within the world. That's sort of what I want to.
I would completely agree with. I mean, I would.
No, but you're saying the exact opposite as far as I'm concerned right now.
Well, I would say, look, I'm an existentialist, right? In this, that I would understand that the precondition of choice is essentially, it doesn't make sense to characterize it as anything other than an indeterminate decision made by an agent. That is all. And in that way, I'm libertarian, right? But if to use that terminology, which I don't particularly like, but in terms of understanding, to have any to give myself intelligibility. Like Sartre would see this as like a sacrifice of myself. Like as soon as I engage in normativity, I've destroyed my freedom. I've become caused by my relationship, sadomasochistically, with the other. Right? Like I've essentially I've engaged in a language I didn't create, a normativity from which existed before I was born, usually. And so when I'm choosing between option A, or even if I choose option A, my conceptions of option A may very well have existed prior to my even having conceived them. So saying that it was my conception is in and of itself a contradiction for Sartre. It's not yours. It was never yours. You just think it is, right? And it's the same. And I would argue in many ways it's very similar for Nietzsche, which is why he keeps rejecting, in the genealogy of morality, he sees all of this as being, the imposition of wills from other people, and the will is constantly imposing itself upon one another in some sort of sick ego game. Now, what I'm saying is that in my construction of a self-consciousness, like, if I agree that like my engagement in my even my first position of self-consciousness is like heteronymous, I'm given morality and stuff from being a child, I'm conditioned, all my desires are sublimated into society, and I'm giving different decisions in this form of normativity. In my engagement in this normativity, the fact that I'm engaging with other people, the fact that I'm actually engaging in this reasoning, I would see as existential. I choose whether to endorse a given language game, a given way of approaching life, a function of reality. I see language as a form of equipment that I can engage with or not. I can either use this hammer or this one. And in such, I'm given meaning to a series of actions. Now, Sartre sees that as ultimately sacrificing my life. I'm sacrificing my freedom, rather. And in that, I'm bad faith. Well, Hegel would see this as an endorsement from one's rational capacities with the normativity of our society, actually coming to the conclusions that one agrees with the universal is an expression of our freedom, because in that we lose this ego game, we lose this sadomasochistic relationship, and we develop a mutual benefit of normativity and a form of reasoning rather than just a natural rational capacity. And so when I say like I choose option A over option B, if I'm doing it, with the reason I would say that option A, if compulsive, would not be freedom, is because it may rely upon a form of normativity which has been conditioned within me from being a child. And so when I even like even without like when I think I'm doing the good, I could be doing harm. And there's no reason to believe that I'm not, I haven't been misled in some sort of perverse genealogy of morality. And I think that the only way to really overcome this, like, sort of existential absurdism is to say, look, you are a rational agent who can, engage in the argumentation and you can deconstruct this form of normativity down to its existential formulation and then go, look, are you going to engage with this form of normativity or that form of normativity? And that's really what the precondition of choice is. We don't get absolute like metaphysical libertarian control over how we gain reality from an individualistic level. That doesn't actually, it's not manifest from ourselves. What we gain is the capacity to endorse forms of normativity in different forms of games, which allows us to essentially have a mutually beneficial relationship with others and ourselves, and that's freedom.
Okay,
I don't.
so I'm not no I don't know if I completely understand everything that you just said because it's a lot. Are you saying ethics is just contractualism?
No, fuck. Oh, absolutely not. One, because like I would take the Hegelian approach that in terms of contract, did you say contractarianism, like as in like yeah, so like he would see ethics as being prior to contracts are actually a form of normativity which is being produced by understanding another individual as being able to fulfill or even engage in contracts. We actually have to actually accept that the other mature adults who are capable of understanding.
Are ethics based upon nothing other than convention for you?
Convention. What do you mean by convention?
So a form of normativity that's going to be based upon mutual agreement of multiple parties.
No, I would say that it's functional in relation to my ongoing engagement with reality. Like I'm being driven by like desire, by urges, by to understand. The will. I would say that I'm willing. There is a will within us all, and then in this, that is the foundation of ethics. Like the trying to gain self understanding and engagement in order to facilitate the active expression of my will, which is a priori. So
Okay, well that I don't understand what the difference between that is and what I'm suggesting right here. If it just seems like you're basically saying it's internal to the agent or it's constitutive of the agent.
well, this is the thing. I think that it's not in like this is the thing. It's hermeneutic, and I think that's the separation. It's not internal to the because if it was internal, then I would be agreeing with Schopenhauer. The will within us, blah blah blah. I think that the will within us, um, I think that we begin from a they in a Heideggerian sense. We begin as the they self rather than an I. We gain even the conception of I is linguistically based, and this internalization of these concepts has conditioned and sublimated our desires in the first place. And so we exist as a universal prior to being an individual. And so the precondition of choice that exists within us as being, agents is our individual faculties. It is our individual capacity for existential analysis and and just our indeterminacy, which is just our.
Hold on, Lewis. Hold on. You're using a lot of words right now that I'm not. Okay, there's two things that you said there that I'm not following.
Okay.
We partake in a universal, and then the second one that you just ended on. What was it?
What our will is in terms of being
no, you said something like we're at first indeterminate, or we're indeterminate with respect to our will, or something like that. I need those two things explained before you continue, because that's
okay. Sorry. So I said that indeterminate in terms of like in respect of our will. Okay. So what I would say is that our understanding. Okay, this is what I would say. I'd say that there is an epistemological versus a metaphysical difference. The will is instanced individually, and that instancing.
What does instancing mean?
actually occurs within reality. So, like, me and you are expressions of will. We are instances of a will.
Okay.
I would say that our language and our conception of self is our universal epistemological accounts of those instances. And in our when we make choices, we do so as instances of will approaching universal categories of just universal categories um or yeah, I think that would be fine, just universal categories, essentially universal notions or something like that, like with ideas, like I don't want to say forms because it's not Platonic, um concepts, and like, you know, I describe myself as an I rather than a we, or I approach a decision in relation to a form of normativity. I would say that non these lose their indeterminacy by being determined by structures of normativity which are endorsed by agents. They form essentially a causal relationship with one another, in which case I could, like, you know, it is essentially the very foundational structures of language, a table, not a chair, and so on. And these are necessary conditions for us to be able to reason. And I would even go so far as I think that this is necessary for us to express freedom as being self-determination. So where Sartre would see freedom as being uncaused, and even like the rejection of language, this a movement to absurdity, just giving into the almost the primordial precondition of choice. And you know, Hobbes or something would see it as just getting what you want, giving yourself over to sublimated desires, already conditioned desires, urges, and forms of normativity which pop into your head, like I'm going to wash my hands, for example. Hegel would see freedom as the mediation between structures of meaning and being able to choose as an independent party whether to endorse one structure of meaning over another.
Wait, sorry. Can you repeat the last portion? Who's choosing to choose the meaning of one thing over another?
Hegel.
Okay, I guess I don't follow. Are you talking about how meaning arises within language right now?
Well, I actually, wait a minute. I'll see if I can go. I think there's a nice. 1 second. Um. 1 second. I'll see if I can find a nice explanation for this, because I know that there's a. Do, do, do. 1 second.
Sure, go ahead.
Okay. The right of intention is that the universal quality of the action shall being not only in itself, but shall be known by the agent, and thus be present all along in his subjective will. And conversely, what we may call the right of the objectivity of action is the right of the action to assert itself as known and willed by the subject as a thinking agent. So, in my attempt to bring around a set of consequences, it is my capacity to take responsibility for those consequences, for the as the endorsement of, I am choosing this option in the first place. I understand what this option is, that I knew all along that this is what my will was trying to achieve. I am the one that chose this, requires an intelligibility between my actual, rather than my intelligibility of the world, which is my endorsement into a given series of actions, a series which are given meaning by my endorsement. So, like, I choose to save someone's life because I understand the normativity of saving their life. But and in doing that, I am free. Now that doesn't necessarily mean that, you said that we could be indifferent to the other to other, possible desires. That's fair enough. I don't disagree. Like there is, like, I think points where there aren't conflicts within our normativity. But when there are conflicts within our normativity, it is reason itself that is the intention of the agents. It is the agent's intention is the engagement not only in reason, but that reason allows us to discover what we are actually trying, what we are intending in the first place. When I engage in a drive in the world, I'm trying to discover what my end is. I'm not just given it. I don't know what it is inherently. I'm trying to discover it. And so for me to what does he say? For thus to have been present in my subjective will, like all along in his subjective will, I am in a process of discovering what end I'm actually trying to achieve when I engage even in this this only category of action. When I choose this categorical, which I don't consider other things in relation to, I'm still engaged in a subject-object distinction. I'm still engaged in a in a function in which I'm trying to achieve a certain ends. I'm trying to engage in a notion of possibility, which will create a given world. Like I'm trying to produce a world from my actions, a world which is given meaning from my rational which is from which I apply meaning to make intelligible, to give meaning, to engage in a series of actions, if that makes sense. My intentional states are only intelligible to me once I engage in language and reason.
Well, I mean, again, I agree with that. That the idea is not whether or not I can understand my subjectivity or myself without language, and that requires other minds. I've already said on air and with you that in order to understand oneself, one needs to know others. In order to understand others, one needs a language. So in order to partake within ethics at all, that's a recognitive ability, right? I mean, Brandom actually uses this exact word. It's a recognitive act. That is, I only through recognition of other people that endorse these certain types of norms that are associated with these certain types of words or sentences. That it is that these words and sentences that I'm uttering need to be legitimized by other people in order for them to get the normativity in language. That's if we agree that language is normative. I think we do agree that languages are normative. They need standards. The meaning horse or mailbox has a certain type of standards. That standard can't be individually created. It needs to be created with other people, and that requires recognition, right? A recognitive act in order for that to arise. But then there's a further push, right, that at least earlier Brandom didn't recognize, and that's that that still can lead us to a form of communitarianism or conventionalism about these norms. So it's one thing to say that language can be not dependent upon an individual. Of course, it can't be private. It needs to be public. But then when we get to the publicity of these norms, that publicity, according to some philosophers like Wright, can just be arbitrary agreement. Now, there needs to be a step further taken, that these norms can't just be individual or conventional, but need to have some aspect to them that is ratification independent, as McDowell likes to put it. That means that there's something about these definitions or these norms that are not dependent upon convention or arbitrary convention or individuals. That is, they have to be based upon some sort of concept. Here's where mind and world comes. That's mind independent. That we're trying to match onto. And And concepts, as far as language goes, cannot be just arbitrarily made, right? So if I have the concept, right,
I would agree with
of
that.
a horse, right, then that concept has to have something in it that I don't get to decide.
I
Something
don't think like
something outside of me, right, has to sort of has to press upon me, and then I have to realize that conceptual force, or that normative force, that then compels me to adopt these certain types of norms. That is where I think you need to get into with ethics, is this sort of ratification independent criterion.
but I would agree. I would agree with that, and I think that's found in. I would say that's found in Hegel,
Yeah,
and
that
that's
is
found in.
no, yeah, it is in Hegel. Yeah, yeah, it is in
Uh,
Hegel. But there's another problem I think there, and that's even if there are these conceptual norms, right, that exist mind independently that we have to be in accordance with. One of the types of problems I think with an externalist account, with respect to adopting certain types of beliefs, is that a sociopath will not be motivated to do those and cannot even comprehend to do those. I'm saying that motivation, to some extent, comes also within, and it's a transcendental quality. It's maybe a noumenal quality of practical cognition. Now, that practical cognition might have some sort of basis in something larger than itself, but I mean, I don't want to. At least I'm hesitant of giving it empirical.
I mean, I would say that, like, I guess I would agree in the sense that I would say that old men desire to know, in that almost like Aristotelian, to use an Aristotelian term. I think that we are compelled to knowledge, in terms of ethics, and that, like, like saying that someone is like, I'm very skeptical of psychological accounts. Like, someone's a psychopath, so they're not motivated to do the good thing. I think that's a little shit. I actually watched, funnily enough, if there's a great YouTube channel. It's like Special Books for Special Kids. And it talks about people, it interviews people with like various like mental health issues and physical conditions and stuff like that.
We can get rid of the idea of the sociopath. We could
Oh,
say that a person who's not a sociopath, that can reason well, that has empathy, has moral motivation, still sees the content of something outside some sort of, because right now we're assuming moral realism, and they still don't care. And they don't care that these moral propositions are truth apted in the world and blah, blah, blah.
Yeah, but I think that requires some sort of Humean position, doesn't it? Like, we are motivated purely by passions. And I think that opens itself perfectly to the critique.
We could be
Is
open.
that our passions themselves are not independent of reason and have already been sublimated and conditioned into a form of normativity before they've even become an intelligible character of the agent. Before I can even say I'm like, I don't care, I have to understand what it means to care, and I have to understand what it means to engage in like the capacities of choice.
Yeah, I don't disagree with that.
Oh, I think we agree on like 90% of stuff here. I don't think that, like, I don't think it's a massive disagreement. I think that the only thing I was saying is
I just don't know if that's enough, is what I'm saying, for an ethical theory. I also think that's kind of orthogonal to the idea that I was bringing earlier about the liberty of indifference. So, well, I mean, one of the reasons I brought up the liberty of indifference is because often, like, Brandom talks about how A, presupposes all of its negations, and, like, when we choose a certain type of... And maybe in action theory, when you say, like, I choose an action A, I might have to contemplate the alternative possibilities of not choosing A. And I'm here saying maybe you don't. Maybe you don't have to contemplate the alternative possibilities. Maybe when you choose A, you just see the sort of force of it. And when you see the force of it, that's it. Like... That's full stop going to be enough for you to make an action that's good. And it doesn't always happen. There might be, and these might be exceptional circumstances, which are rare, when we just act for a fact of reason and just a fact of reason alone. But I think it happens. And I think it happens somewhat analogically to, say, let's say that I was to lift up this pen in front of the audience, or to you, right? Let's just say that you've never seen this pen before in your life. At that moment, I'm guessing if I was to ask you, well, am I holding up a pen? You'd say yes. And you would say, well, I mean, I have a good inductive account of you lifting up a pen, and I think I'm justified in that. Now, you might then look at your prior motivations before that. Was there any prior motivation for you to believe that this pen was here? Was there any prior motivation of of you feeling a certain type of way about pens? And you'd probably say no. It's just the case that you're holding up a pen, and at that moment, I'm sort of compelled to believe in it. You don't choose to believe in it. It's a sort of involuntary act, no prior motivation to it. I don't mean there's no prior evidence that can substantiate that, but no prior motivation. And in the same sense, there might not be a prior motivation to choose A, the action, ethical action or categorical action A, over other types of actions. And if there is, I might also be at the same time, second point, indifferent to it. I'm showing a liberty of indifference towards it. That's a certain type of negative freedom.
See, I think like talking about motivation, like what motivates you, like to me, I think, like I find it quite confusing, primarily because I don't see like it's like trying to talk about something which exists. We are the motivation, like we are the will. So when you say like, well, what motivates me into act A, in choosing act A or B, or just why I'm motivated into B, it's like, well, no, I am the will, I am the willing, I am the process of engagement with the world. And so like I don't necessarily see a reason why. I think that,
but that's my point. That's my point right there. It's just like you don't need a prior motivation because what's willing is constitutive of human reasoning. You don't need to look external to you to know what to do. If human reasoning supplies you practical cognition, if it's constitutive of human reasoning itself, then that is going to motivate you in a sort of transcendental or noumenal capacity.
But I don't see the difference between, like, the thing is, I agree, I think, in many ways, but I don't see that it's not an act of pure reason. For example, I think that the Hegelian kind of point is to say that there isn't anything that pure about it, and like there is the individual is constitutive of an engagement with the world, which is we don't reason out some sort of a priori condition and then so engage with it. We reason in order to fulfill
the very point of the critique of pure reason or the critique of judgment is to show the very process of how we come about to these non-empirical transcendental conditions. And,
yeah.
And it's a deduction. It's a deduction. I mean, it's just like it showed how they're not.
I think it's a deduction, and he's saying that these are the necessary conditions for us, to actually engage with reality, and they're not some, and very many of them, like the unity of apperception. I'm not gonna say he's wrong because I don't think he is. I think what the difference, what I'm saying, is that it's kind of like what's he called? What's he called? Wait a minute. Wait a minute, I need to remember. It's actually a quote. 1 second. Right. It says
just quickly, someone saying something about the reason being analogous to the soul in my chat. The funny thing is like you can consider, you could go ahead and do that while I kind of talk to the audience to give you some time. Yeah. The funny thing is about calling reason analogous or something akin to the soul is that can be either true or not true depending on what type of historical context you're looking at. So I mean, like, reason was, or the rational soul was considered a part of the tripartite soul for Plato, and then for Aristotle, the rational mind consisted upon an even smaller fabric of the overall soul that Aristotle had. What we mean by soul today, and you know, if we were to look at the notion of what a soul is outside of the philosophical historical canon, it could mean, like, I don't know, like some sort of transparent, will-o'-the-wisp, sort of intangible object that somehow manifests itself invisibly in our body. You know, I mean, like, that's not what we're getting at when we're talking about reason. And that wouldn't be analogous in any sort of sense with human reasoning. Now, if we're skeptical of human reasoning itself, and you're just saying, like, okay, it's as skeptical as we are of, you know, the idea that anything that we call immaterial or mental is just a sort of fiction. Now, that's just a type of philosophical view that we call eliminativism, which needs to be, I think, argued for. I don't think, like, people can just say things like these are just fictions, or say that reason is a fiction. So by reason, I just mean, you know, thinking properly with inferences, being able to formulate inferences, beliefs, having intentions, things like that, right? Being able to, you know, do logic, or being able to think with principles and maxioms and etc., things like that. So yeah.
Right. So I found the quote that I was looking for.
Yeah, go ahead.
So, how is it that the absolute I goes out of itself and opposes a not I to itself? That was Schelling, right? And I think what I would say, you said, like, perhaps it could be a noumenal, like the noumenal self. It's like that's what I would disagree with that. I don't think there is a noumenal self. I think that there is consciousness trying to understand itself. It's not to say that it's noumenal and non-accessible, or that it can never be accessed in this sort of in this way. It's to say that when we talk about something prior to the existence of consciousness, we are engaged in a form of metaphysical and epistemological error in the first place. And so when I talk about acts of motivation that precede the existence of my consciousness, I've already essentially implied a causal account of the self to something else external.
I don't mean, I've never, if I have, I was wrong. I've never said precede. I'm not using temporal language. Transcendental language is not preceding anywhere. It's not coming prior to. It's not located anywhere. It is just merely a transcendental or noumenal, and the distinction is really finely cut. It depends on what portion in Kantian philosophy you're looking at. It just means that we're not dealing with empirical notions. We're not trying to say that whatever the basis of our reasoning is based upon some sort of empirical a posteriori account. It's just going to be an a priori account. It's going to be abstracted from empirical content. And I think as long as you buy into that, you're going to have to buy into some sort of noumenal realm. But I know that this is exactly what Hegel wants to sort of oppose. But I think that this is also, like, one of the hardest, you know, exactly one of the hardest types of arguments to go over at this point, if you want to go into the noumenal.
Well, I think this is probably where I would like side with someone like, you know, Heidegger, and it's not like that I'm going to conclude the question of being, like, what is being or whatever. It's more of the fact that, like, it's more of like how I even ask the question is changed after I begin asking it. The existentialia of what I am is modified by my investigation, which is the relationship of the self to the self. It's trying to look beyond the self is the issue when I start trying to look beyond to forms of motivation that exist, like, external to mind. I've already, like,
so yeah.
I've already
So the word maybe the word you're looking for is that thinking is a generative act, right? And thinking about thinking is a generative act. So via thinking about our thinking, we have thought something differently. I mean, Kant basically says the same thing about aesthetic judgments. Is they're a generative act. We create beauty when we try to apprehend something within the world, right? Because we don't just apprehend beauty. There it is, boom, right? We apprehend some sort of content. We give it life. We give it certain types of. We conceptualize it, sort of, right? We impregnate it with concepts, and then we generate something novel to it. And yeah, I mean, I agree that there's some sort of generative capacities that once you instantiate a mind, right? Once you instantiate a community, once you instantiate whatever, you're going to get new emergent novel properties, and one of them is going to be this type of generative property, and then whatever other types of properties that generate out of the generative properties. So.
But this is the thing. But if we take this account, then this is the thing. I think we both I think we would both agree then. I would agree with you that looking towards an empirical account of motivation to action is nonsense. But that doesn't necessarily mean that we need to ground it in pure reason. It's just I'm not a fan, I guess. Really, what I'm saying in this is in the idea of separating reason. So in terms of psychoanalytic accounts of
but Lewis, come on. I mean, it's just like that. I mean, if you've read the literature, there is a sense of where Kant separates reason from reality. But what else? But what else does he do? He synthesizes the goddamn thing to where it's impossible to have reason without the world. I mean, it's just like, this is saying that he's just abstracting it, and just abstracting it is the greatest misconception of Kant that you can possibly give.
I just don't see why we necessarily must come to the conclusion that reason can be separated from things like the passions and from whatever else it means to be a conscious acting agent. It seems to me, I think, almost a hang up from when we talk about for example, if we look at Plato, or when we see reason as essentially the driving force of the chariot and so on, and then we have noble and ignoble desires. I don't see it as like that. I don't see reason as being the agent and their motive force. I see it as just another part of the agent, and I see the agent themselves as being the act of motivation. They are the motivation's existential. It comes from what they are.
There's a qualified sense of when Kant talks about reason being divorced from our passions, right? So the reason why we choose to do certain types of actions when we act in accordance with duty are going to be reasons that are based divorced from prior passions and desires in the Humean sense. They're not divorced in another sense, that is that every single type of action that I do that's good is immediately accompanied by a desire or passion of some sort, right? So when I do the good, and I often do the good, there's going to be a dispositional tendency to feel good about it. And that's what we call when we build character. And that's why Kant's theory of ethics is actually compatible with virtue ethics, because he thinks that, I mean, in order to even achieve this state of practical cognition, one first has to go through the hoops of building a character, building an ethical character that we call the goodwill. It doesn't just spontaneously arise from nowhere. It obviously occurs from childhood development and through certain types of empirical state of affairs. But once we get there, right, we have a certain type of action with the will that we can act indifferently towards prior passions and develop newer passions as a result of our ethical obligations. So it's not so much that Kant is saying that we're just this dry, brittle, always emotionally impartial person acting from duty, to where we should not love, the rest of life, or we shouldn't love our friends, or the concept of love doesn't even exist. I mean, if you want, we can open up the metaphysics, the groundworks for the metaphysics of moral, where he talks about love and where he talks about virtue and where he talks about the goodwill, including, and this is why I began this conversation, including all those various things. So there's a caveated sense of where it's not without in the same sense that he uses without passions, but it is independent from passions in some actions, right? I mean, you understand obviously what that would mean for Kant, right?
Sorry, could you repeat the last sentence there?
Yeah, you can act without you can't act without passions, but you can act independent of them. In the same sense that, you know, like we can achieve knowledge that's without experience. Sorry, not without experience. It's always going to include experience, but we can be independent of experience.
I guess it depends on what you mean. It's like I don't necessarily like see a reason why I guess this is the point, right? So I see reason as not necessarily being separate from the passions. I don't see why I think like I can see like so for example, I can see irrational passions but that contain normativity. I can see I can see drives that are ignorable because they're so insignificant or like they don't even come to my or one I've never even cognized them, or if I did I don't give a shit because they're so insignificant in terms of um the how they actually impact my motivation, like my will. Like I don't even engage with them. I don't see and there's no necessity to engage with them. That would be fair enough. I would agree with that. But to say that it is an act of motivation from pure reason alone, I think it's as I take it as almost akin to this. It's just the it's the negation almost of the Humean account. Like, no, we aren't moved by passions, we are moved by reason. It's no, we are moved by both. We are both. That is what we are. We do not separate them. There is no reason to separate them. And there's like the only reason we do separate them is, I think, is this philosophical hang up on the fact that we can reject reasons and reject passions. And sometimes we do either or. Sometimes we're motivated hedonistically, and sometimes we're motivated abstractly in relation to religious, like pietism or something like that, in terms of some sort of abstract goal. But I think all of this shows, to be entirely honest with you, that a drive is comprised of what it means to be human, and this is probably why I like Schiller in that respect. And what it means to be human is this combination of the passions and reason. They're not something that is separable.
Yeah, I don't think. I mean, they're separable in one sense, but not in another. As I said earlier in the conversation, I don't think Kant is saying that you should wholly separate your passions altogether, right? I mean, again, aspects of the goodwill and acting from the goodwill can include, I think, those types of things. So
exactly, you did say that. You did say that. You did actually say that. An individual engaged in the goodwill could be doing so out of an emotional component, a passion, in relation to the friendship of her other, or even in this point of, it's almost in rejection of the Calvinist fervor, isn't it? Where he said, "Oh, so you enjoyed that? Well, then you're going to hell." You know what I mean? Because you haven't done it from a purely motivational sense of what is a rational good. I would agree. I don't think that you necessarily have to take that position from Kant, but understanding the and deconstructing the positions as themselves, I think obviously then the role of psychoanalysis and I think Hegel leads on to that account. Like, he's like, look,
well, how about this? Yeah, go ahead. Finish your sentence.
Oh, sorry, I was just going to say, like, there's no reason to believe that, like, so for example, why is it that this drive is presenting to me this way? Like, why is it that I see this categorical movement towards this? Why am I thinking this way? And that's the existential analysis from that we need to engage in.
Okay, well, I'll leave it at this then. I'll let you sleep on the liberty of indifference and see what you have to say.
Yeah, I guess. I mean, like, it's obviously my first engagement with it, so maybe I'm just coming at it the wrong way anyway, or maybe it's that, or I don't know. We'll see.
Also, you should read Alan Wood's Kant's ethical theory because it's really good and helps clarify a lot of the types of misconceptions of Kant.
Definitely give it. I'll give it a go. I mean, I'm honestly, I'm just so behind on me reading anyway. I
It's a,
just it's
it's a,
painful.
yeah. I haven't been reading that much lately. I've been taking a good long break from philosophy for.
Engaged in that practical Bildung, man, as as Gadamer calls it. You're building your knowledge of reality through engaging with engaging with the physical. You're engaging with the application rather than the theoretical.
I guess you could say it. I guess in that way. I didn't want to get too far into it, but I mean, it's related to certain type of recent events, and also because I wanted to, rock climb a lot more and go to the gym a lot more. So, not deal with the drama of the internet because it can be a big fucking cesspool of people with way too much time on their hands trying to do silly things. So, but
I think unfortunately, like this is kind of why I was engaged in that whole saying like you can be engaged with perverse reasons because like I think Slavoj Žižek says it best where he says there's this old Slovakian saying like where he comes from where a farmer it's like a story where a farmer is asked by God and he says I'll give you anything you want but know this whatever I give you I'll give your neighbor give your neighbor double and he goes here take my eye and I think that's it like
okay.
uh people are always trying to one up each other. They're trying to like establish their identities through the negation of each other, engaged in bad faith interactions. It's like the internet, like honestly, it can be fucking shit. But I think that it's only, I think all it's doing in some respects is bringing to light some of the more nuanced relationships that we well bringing to light, making explicit some of the more nuanced implicit relationships that have been there since like the dawn of man. So
God, that's funny. I don't. Maybe it's hard to say because that's an unfalsifiable statement. Not that I care too much about unfalsifiable statements. If it's a good story, it might be a good story. But I just have a feeling like the types of culture wars and the type of culture just in Discord and on YouTube and on Twitch.
cancel culture. Oh.
It's not just the cancel culture. It's just a lot of people who have nothing better to do with their lives other than debate endlessly, cancel each other, and just trying not to be as much as they can good faith actors. Yeah, I mean I don't know. It's a lot of sleazy sort of
Oh,
behavior.
I actually completely agree. I think there was a lot of I think that it's getting a little bit worse if I'm honest. I think that like rhetoricians like are becoming far more popular and I hate to say this because I don't think that like look, I like Destiny. Like I engage with the guy. I think he's pretty cool. Um and you know what? I don't even think, as much as I'm critical of the guy, that Vorsh is wholly evil or anything like that. Um but it's kind of like Destiny talking to book smarts and stuff like that and trying to work out how they can improve their rhetoric and I can't help but feel the like almost sophistic account of it all. It's all like, how do I win the argument and convince more people? And then Destiny's trying to get people to become Democrats and stuff. And Vorsh is like, how can I de-radicalize this fucking neo-Nazi or whatever? And all we're doing is approaching, debate and discussion with an outside motivation. It's not about finding truth. It's not about moving through the conversation and engaging in the concepts and actually, as you say, being a good faith actor to one another. No. It has something to do with some sort of political goal or some sort of self-interested goal. And that's becoming more and more common. I certainly see more of that. And I think the reason it's becoming more and more common, and I think the unfortunate reality of it is that people like it, the engage in it, the like the drama, they like the fucking the like the stupid arguments um and the like, oh my god, like he just fucking destroyed this person and these stupid little fucking battles that they have between communities that of course don't exist. I'm sorry, I'm of the position that Vorsh and Destiny actually probably really like each other and are probably friends. I don't think that any of the drama probably exists, and I think they're actually quite clever business people, and I think that's shown by their success online. And I think that's the reality of it. I think we've got to be stupid to engage in like petty disputes for this, but I think that why we do it is because It works. It just works. People get propaganda. Like propaganda fucking works. Like that's how humans have existed now for at least 2,000 years. I mean, at least.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know what else I could say about that. It's just like there's something more to. There's just something more to this culture that it's really hard to pinpoint down. But like, if you've seen the criticisms of each other, of the type that are especially going in Discord and Twitch, they're just like, it's like watching a particular type of journalist try to smear someone's name. They always abstract something out of context. They always try to get the juiciest type of script possible. And it's always kind of like manipulative and deceptive. And that type of rhetoric seems to be getting increasingly popular and wrapped around in moral language, in false moral language that begins to destroy and collapse the distinction between not good and evil, because what they're criticizing is, of course, morally repugnant traits. They're doing that. They're a lot of these types of, I mean, a lot of this type of cancel culture isn't completely dead wrong. A lot of the people that are making fun of, you know, streamers or whatever for being wrong about this are critiquing, you know, unethical behavior. It's just that they don't know how to distinguish between things that are minorly morally repugnant and actual atrocities anymore. We focus so much on really woke liberal bullshit right now.
Yeah, I completely agree with the woke issue. Like, there's actually, like, to add to that, just to quickly say, there's actually I've been meaning to watch it. You know that guy that criticized philosophy tube? He's a philosophy professor. He's actually just made a video on wokeism, and I think he described it as like a new age religion, and I think he's probably right in that. Like, but continue. Sorry.
Yeah, no, I mean that's interesting. You should say that, because one of the other types of things that I've been thinking about is just that I think this sort of liberal mindset right now, and I hate saying this, you know, I hate using these types of words because I haven't found the exact correct words to describe the situation. Because as soon as you say things like woke, liberal, then you immediately get portrayed within the opposite end as being a staunch conservative, and it's just like, but it's not just that. It's literally, if you partake within these types of criticisms, you really do blur the distinction between wokeism and like actually good practiced ethics. You eliminate the you eliminate the distinction between being able to find out what is good and between what is really bad and morally atrocious and just slightly bad and offending. And you know, it's like no one wants to partake in that type of activity, sure, but it's not like people are dying. It's not like you're addressing, like, saying like, oh, you know, it's okay to murder people. And as a matter of fact, saying like it's okay to murder people these days would not get you canceled, but anything related to LGBTQ issues would get you canceled, right? Any moment of where you use certain types of slurs would get you canceled. And I'm not trying to justify these. By any means, I'm not trying to justify any of these types of incidences.
I completely agree. And I think that and I think that one of the funniest things in it is how much this goes against a lot of the work that, you know, many of these people would hail as perhaps the reason why they would engage or should and ought to engage in understanding something like gender as being a social construct. And I mean, what I'm referencing here is Foucault, right? Like, Foucault would not see, like, if I would take a Foucauldian account, if I'm honest, I don't think Foucault would see this as necessarily a good thing. And I think that, like, and I don't think we necessarily see it as a bad thing either. I think that it's emergence. For me, I like to look at it in almost in a Lacanian account. I think that its emergence really is what we'll have is a capitalistic, commodified society in which all political discourse is based around certain dogmas, right? Like, you know, we'll have the Republicans, we'll have the Democrats, and everyone associates with certain hegemonic organizations which contain in themselves reasons which have been constructed by power structures. and obviously agents as well. Like it's not just power structures doing everything; there's agents involved as well. And in that, everyone's trying to express their desires. Everyone's trying to like engage in reality to create some sort of a good end to some degree. And so we'll have this balance between the id and the superego. And I think for the American consciousness, especially, I would characterize the Republicans in many ways as the id, the libertarian expression of desire. I want the freedom to do what I want. And then I would characterize the Democrats as the superego. You know, this almost neurotic, obsessive compulsive neurosis that we can only express desires in a very particular format, which is becoming more and more normalized and narrower. And I think the funny thing is that we went from what was a rejection of unnecessary social structures which were confining human action in a way which was negative and unethical, which is what I think was happening with, let's say, gender and sexuality and prejudice and bigotry, which I think we can all agree with is genuinely unethical, like racism, sexism, so on, horribly wrong, to a point in which now the people who are engaged in rejecting these dogmas for a reason that was not actually grounded, for a reason that was simply bad faith, continue the rejection in terms of that neurotic compulsion to only be able, and I say this as someone who's neurotic, so you can't judge us, to essentially, like only express desires in such a way that they confine to some sort of moral endeavor, when in reality, look, like the stark reality of this is that when an individual engages in non-woke behavior, if it's not necessarily causing any moral harm, then we need to ask ourselves the question why we are chastising people who are engaged in actions which are absolutely fine. Like, they're not doing anything wrong, but they're being chastised for them. And I think that that's happening more and more, where people are just being thrown under the bus for not doing anything particularly that we can ground as being wrong, where we can't go, well, look at the damage that this is causing. And we also need to look at perhaps the fact that in creating this kind of like perverse moral code, this moral code that necessarily is ungrounded, that we create harms, that we now have more and more means to be insulted and harmed and perpetuate a more vulnerable psyche, which ultimately becomes, less capable of dealing with the world and the pains that they're going to face. Like an individual who's easily offended and easily insulted. And I think that like the way we're approaching the situation is incredibly backward. But I guess I would end that like little monologue with the only thing that both sides have right is that they're both wrong.
So I mean, I agree with everything that you said there. I would add one caveat, because I want to be careful with my own language, is that I think that people who are offended at certain types of things are rightfully offended at a lot of these types of things that we're seeing on media and on the internet, and I do think that a lot of things that are related to the LGBT community, transgendered individuals, feminism, things like related to pronouns. These are things that need to be addressed, and people who are against these types of ways can be morally repugnant to certain types of degrees, right?
Absolutely, yeah.
What I am kind of more apprehensive of is the degree of punishment that is never proportional to the crime. By that I just mean it seems as though people are much more morally outraged at certain types of things that they need to be, and largely it goes to the extent that we can't even question things anymore, say related to sex or gender,
100%.
without being complete constructivists about it, for example.
I completely agree. People were saying this. I mean, there was actually there was a recent court case in the UK, I think it was, where someone like got sacked for making a point where they said like you can change your gender, but you can't change your sex. Now, even in the philosophy of gender, that is a really uncontroversial statement. Now, as far as I'm aware, that's all she said. So I'm basing it off that, from what I'm aware. You know, I didn't do me max amount of research into this, but that's not like that uncontroversial, right? It's just going to the point when you're just saying you can change your gender for at least. I mean, we would have considered that woke at one point. We would have been like, wow, that's really progressive. But now she's losing that job for it. And it just shows it's like, when is it enough? And this is the point I think Foucault makes, man. We are perpetuating more and more norms. When we reject a norm, we don't get out of normativity. We just make new ones. And it's trying to see, like, you know, this trying movement towards, like, you know, freeing ourselves from these unfair structures. We need to be, you know, and you know what? Actually, it's that Nietzsche quote, isn't it? When we do battle with monsters, that we need to be sure we do not become ones. We do not become them. I think that's exactly what happens. Like, we don't realize that we do it. We become hyper vigilant, and it's so easy to become hyper vigilant. Where we start, like, you know, for example, the rejection of racism leads to positive discrimination or something like that. And it's like, well, look, that's not what we were aiming for. We're not aiming, like, to reject racism. Well, we are, but we're not aiming to reject racism absolutely in terms of well, we are actually, sorry, we're not aiming to, sorry, we don't base our judgments off what racism is or is not. We do it off the basis of what is fair and should be done. Racism isn't the standard from which we base our judgments. We aren't trying to be anti-racist. We're trying to be good people. And in that, we are anti-racist. And that shows how we ought to behave in reality, you know?
Yeah, that's. I mean, depending on how you put that, I might agree with it. I don't know. It almost sounds like you wanted to sort of also create a distinction between a culture of guilt and a culture of shame. You know how guilt sort of forces people to turn inward, and then shame sort of forces us to turn outward, right? I mean, shame is going to be directed externally into the world and how people, you know, shame the other person. Guilt is going to be towards the internal manifestations of that person's psychology and how they deal with these sorts of things. And what I guess I'm trying to express myself is that I'm not sure if I would completely, you know, get rid of shame or anything like that, but it seems as though our society needs to head towards more of a society of guilt instead of a society of shame.
Ooh,
and that when we and then
when
we're making these types of criticisms of people, and then when we're changing these, when we're trying to change them, we need some level of forgiveness, and we need some level of being able to figure out that when people are making these mistakes, they're not fundamental, deep down, internal essences of these types of people, but they're actually inferential structures that can change, and that often will change if they're motivated in certain types of ways, if they're motivated in certain types of ethical ways. And one of the things that I see that woke culture does, or cancel culture does, is that it assumes a certain type of narrative, and that's like an essentialistic narrative of where that person can't change, and once they've made the mistake, they have to be damned for the rest of their life.
I completely agree.
And then what else could it be? Because if you cancel someone, you're targeting their job, you're targeting their lively manner, you're accusing, and you're going through various forms of defamatory discourse.
And it absolutely annihilates the possibility of rehabilitation for the person who, if they have done something wrong, they are now not seen as being able to be motivated out of that prior reasoning.
Unless they're, I mean, yes, yeah, exactly. Unless you're of that type of variety of people that doesn't believe in rehabilitation, which is very odd because, you know, I think modern psychology would be sort of against that that type of theory that moral rehabilitation is just not something that we need to even ethically consider. That seems to be more of a kind of a caricature of a person with a stone cold heart than anything else.
Yeah, I agree. And I mean, like one of the best examples, I think it was a while ago, there was that black guy who went disguised at KKK rallies or whatever and managed to like convince loads of KKK members that they were wrong.
Right. Yeah,
like befriended them and then like was like, I'm black, and then they're like, oh my god, like that worldview was shattered, and that was like a form of like exposure therapy essentially to reality. Like, oh my god, the ideology that I'm perpetuating is untrue. Or like, I mean, as or like American History X, when it's like attempt to show like someone who goes from a racist murderer and is rehabilitated by his experience with like black people in prison, or something like that. Like, I think that like these things are possible. I think that rehabilitation is absolutely possible. But I guess there's one caveat, like in terms of when you said we need to go from a society of shame to a society of guilt. And you know what? I think that we are contemporarily both, and we are a walking paradox because we've split what I would consider a universal self. I'm a Hegelian, into these multiple dichotomous identities. Um, in my being white, for example, I'm supposed to feel some notion of guilt, and others are allowed to shame me, even if they are white themselves. A lot of the time, they are actually white themselves. So, for example, like the notion of whiteness, people and it's
Yeah,
infested our society to the
yeah,
point in which people talk about whiteness as if like someone said, you don't just because you're white doesn't mean you have to be white. I don't even know what that means. And then there was other people who are saying like white veganism and the and stuff like that. It's like you've managed to politicize and was it fragment, or at least attempted to fragment, what is an equality movement devoted for the consideration of others. You've managed to make it about the people involved than about the victims we're considering. And at that point, I think that the morality is absolutely perverse.
yeah, yeah. I do. I really do like the distinction that I sort of made earlier, and then you kind of helped clarify that. There is a certain sense of where I don't think we would disagree that being white and straight, or basically born a white straight male, has a certain level of privilege associated with it that people have to acknowledge. And if I may make the analogy, it's sort of analogous to maybe kind of, and crudely analogous to sort of like surviving a plane or a boat crash of some sort, and you're one of the sole survivors of it, and you get this sort of guilt complex that
Yeah, that's
I
guilt.
I have I have this certain type of privilege. I feel guilty, but you'd never shame the person for surviving that boat accident or that car crash or something like that. Um, and so it seems as though there's a sort of misplaced
Animosity.
animosity or hostility towards towards these types of people, um, to where they're not really, I think, seeing this distinction between guilt and shame and how it ought to have a certain type of efficacious hold on us.
Yeah,
Um,
I completely agree. I definitely agree.
and, and secondly, it just seems like as soon as you mention that, right? As soon as you mention that, then it means like, oh well, he doesn't realize the certain types of struggles that other minorities have to go through. And no, it doesn't mean that. You can obviously see that there's a lot of struggles that minorities have to go through, that the LGBT community has to go through. But that
Well,
doesn't justify shame. And of course, but it does, I think, justify guilt. I think that we ought to rightfully feel guilty, and we ought to rightfully do things that create a sense of
I don't think
equilibrium and
it.
justice.
This is the thing. I don't think it necessarily does justify guilt. I think that
Hmm.
guilt in this sense can become a hindrance to the possibility of manifesting change. Like, understanding in a situation shouldn't necessarily manifest even guilt. It should manifest shame on the people who are perpetuating the crime. Like the actual racist is what deserves shame. The individual understanding their place in terms of racism as the non-race, as the one that's not facing racial prejudice, but is also not prejudiced to others, shouldn't feel guilt for that position. Do you know what I mean? And I also think that as on top of this, it's like I think intersectional accounts of power, hegemony, identity, and politics ultimately are far more complex than what people realize. And the narratives that we hear today are far too simplistic. They
There's
do
a
not
There's a
obtain reality.
there's an interesting account given to me by one of my friends. She doesn't want me to say her real name, but I think she was on your air actually, with Lysa, at least her username. Anyway, she basically said something along the lines of we're starting to become more critical of the notion of indigenousness. That we have this sort of defense of Native Americans as being indigenous to North America, and that in some sort of way legitimizes them to the land. But now we're becoming sort of more critical of the idea of indigenousness, because nobody's really indigenous to a certain type of land, right? I mean, other than Africa, is what she was sort of claiming, which is a sort of interesting critique, because the very first thing that people would think of is that we're being insensitive to Native Americans at that point. And we would be sort of ignoring colonialism. But that's not what's going on. It's not that we're ignoring colonialism. It's that we're ignoring the idea, or rather critiquing the idea, that blood and soil is something that you can own, right? And this is exactly what would be a critique of, say, Nazi Germany in a sense. It's that they're driven to the idea of blood and soil.
Exactly.
You can still critique imperialism and colonialism. It's just, you would critique those things, but you would not endorse the idea of indigenousness as being something that we have a right to, or land is something that we have an exclusive right to, right? I mean, this is like a sort of, I think, if you want to make it a more broad historical critique, a kind of critique of private property or private ownership altogether, right? So, that's just I think now becoming a little bit more apparent to people. So.
As well, I think that there's an added, I think that there's an irony to all this, and I think this is why I love Hegel's concept of the irony of the subjective, right? Because I think Zizek really points this out in saying, you're Native American. We are implying that we are cultural American. You do not have ownership or rights within the cultural construction of what this is. And also, your identity is defined in relation to our cultural identity. Your identity is that of the 300 years ago, this is how you used to act, and this is how you are always going to act kind of conception of the self. Well, no, the individual has the capacity to take ownership of their culture, and if their and reject aspects of it, to change it, to manifest it in new and radically different ways. It's their culture. They can do what the fuck they want with it, and it's not defined by our relationship with it. And I think it's fundamentally racist. And we usually and one of the worst things is when we give them the identity of the victim. Well, the worst part of this is there was aspects of what were I don't know. I don't even know what to call them. Like whether I want to, I'll say Native American just because it's the most probably the most accepted term at this point. But in terms of the Apache tribes and so on, they rejected the notion of being a victim. They stood against and fought to the death rather than accept civility. We are rejecting what was the freedom fighters and the defiance of a people when we see them and characterize them as purely a victim identity. It's like, no, they're not victims. They're badass, man. They're winning half the time. Like, why are you seeing them as someone who's necessarily, you can understand the wrongness of the Americans coming in and, lacing smallpox on blankets without seeing the Native Americans as victims. The unfortunate reality of it is that it screams a power dynamic and an understanding of self in relationship to how they want to understand themselves, and the woke liberal individual in the United States wants to understand themselves as a victim, or they want to understand other people as a victim and themselves as a hero. And what they don't understand is that they're actually just moving between poles in which they're putting one person as a perpetrator, one person as a hero, and one person as a victim, so they can fulfill some sort of pathological mandate within themselves without actually considering what the reality of the scenario was.
Yeah, I definitely agree with a lot of that. There's I do kind of want to end on this note coming up here. If you do have one more thing to say after this, but kind of reached about 2 hours and 30 minutes, and I wanted to eat some things fairly soon since I'm going to be working out a little bit more. There's a really good book that I kind of saw on a shelf. I didn't read it, so I can't comment too much about this. But since you were talking about polarity between certain types of political parties, it was recent. I don't know if you know the philosopher Simone Weil. I think I told you about her a little bit. She wrote a book, and it was like 120 pages, and I need to get to that. It was against all political parties, and I think the message there was just the idea that just because you disagree with one person on this issue or another person on that issue, whether it be left or right, doesn't mean you're going to disagree or agree with them on other types of issues. And it seems as though political parties are doing more of a disservice these days than anything else. It creates a larger polarity. It sort of nicely tries to pigeonhole people in a certain type of area. And then nothing is ever sort of resolved in virtue of that type of polarity and that pigeonholing. And if anything, it sort of thinks for you, right? These political parties begin sort of thinking for you.
100%.
But anyways, yeah, go ahead.
Hegemonic. Yeah, hegemonic, absolutely. I mean, like, to be entirely honest with you, I take this very similar approach to notions of privilege and understanding privilege in the first place. These people, like, I saw a very wealthy person saying that, like, you know, they understand that they are, that not everyone has access to, you know, what they do because they're white. Well, no, man. Like, they don't have access to what you do because you are a fucking millionaire. What are you talking about? Like, you don't understand. Like, the whiteness isn't the main advantage in this scenario. Your abundance of wealth takes priority, you know? But because of the, you know, the hegemony of a certain political narrative, they may see it in terms of race rather than class. And the reality of intersectionalism is to say that, look, like, no doubt there is like, how it is balanced can be hegemonic. People can see certain narratives in certain ways because it's hegemonic, but also, like, it is so unbelievably complex. Like, and we can do people a disservice when we oversimplify it for ourselves and our own agenda. And the best example for this, I think, is probably is brought out in the education report the report on racism and institutional racism in the UK. What we found is that what was found in the report was that the characterization of BAME, you know, Black, Asian, minority, what is it? I'll actually read the thing. So it was it Black, Asian, and minority ethnic. That doesn't actually hold any value because now we can't distinguish between minority groups and they are characterized as just not being white. So what we end up with is, for example, an inconsideration of the fact that African English students outperform Caribbean English students for separate reasons in relation to, you know, how they're engaging in the institution. And so now we're not effectively approaching the disproportionate, like, so for example, African kids perform better than white kids. African boys perform better than white boys statistically in British schools, but Caribbean boys also perform terribly. So what we have to do is, rather than make these broad characterizations where we just throw everyone as not white, it would make more sense, rather than giving into this sort of liberal wokeness, to actually, like, analyze the situation and how can we make these people's lives better, like, get back to ethics, as you say.
I definitely agree with some of the things that you said there. I think I would caveat maybe a little bit, but I did want to end it right there since we are exactly on the 2 hour and 30-minute mark.
Yeah,
but it's been a good conversation perspective, or Lewis. It's been a while since we've talked, so it's definitely good to get back into the game a little bit.
Yeah, it's talking, man. It really is, and I'm happy to see you again.
Yeah, absolutely, dude. By the way, how hot is it right now in Newcastle?
I'm boiling, but I'll check the actual temperature. It's 19 degrees apparently, but I'm roasting. That's incredibly hot. Yeah, actually, it's saying 26 degrees. Actually,
26.
Yeah, so that's how it feels. It is certainly. I'm melting.
19 would be like if I'm looking at this, us Americans have to sometimes convert it, but 19 would be fucking amazing right now. It's like 95 Fahrenheit right here, and my air conditioning is not working. So, not working well anyway, so I'm boiling right here.
What is that in Celsius?
Let's see.
I can't think of it. Wait a minute, 95.
It's
35.
yeah,
Ooh,
it's
that's
35.
hot, man. That's fucking hot. I'm like, it's 26, and I'm melting. So
Yeah.
you're like 11 degrees hotter. That's unfortunate, man. But I don't know. I guess yeah, free trip to Spain. That's pretty much for us.
Someone is telling us to read the book Afro-Pessimism. I've actually heard of this. I think it was on the Verso books, but I'm not sure what this was in reference to. Maybe in our conversation about race earlier. I have heard good things about this book, though. I've been meaning to read it, or at least meaning to look at it.
I'll definitely check it out. I guess like a lot of my in terms of a lot of my account comes from a very pessimistic notion where it seems like a lot of the engagement in wokeism and the ethic that we have today has more to do with the instantiation of our own identities rather than actually making people's lives better. And I guess that's all I'm really trying to say.
Yeah, absolutely. All right, Lewis. It's been good. I will wrap the stream up with you, but thank you for coming once again, and you have a good one for now, all right, dude?
You too, mate. Take it easy.
All right, bye-bye. All right, guys. Thanks for joining me for another stream. I know it's been a long, long time since my last stream. I haven't been so much busy as I've kind of been busy. I mean, trying to find a new job right now. Not making enough money as an adjunct lecturer for sure at the college that I'm going to. Also rock climbing and working out a lot, which has been great for my sleep. I've been able to sleep a lot faster. Only I've been reading sort of sparsely a little bit of philosophy here and there. But that being said, I will have, as I said earlier on my stream, a conversation with Ian McGilchrist. Ian McGilchrist most likely in June and July. At least that's what it was told, that I'd be able to have that conversation with him. And for those of you who don't know who Ian McGilchrist is, I'm going to now show a video, just because I think it's a very interesting and good video. Hold on, I'm gonna have to actually go back. Video source, Windows capture. He wrote a book basically on the division of the left and right hemispheres, and it basically goes over this. I'll post this video, or I'll let this video play out just so you guys know who I'm talking with later on. Anyways, after that, I'll end the stream.
The division of the brain is something neuroscientists don't like to talk about anymore. It enjoyed a sort of popularity in the 60s and 70s after the first split brain operations, and it led to a sort of popularization which has since been proved to be entirely false. It's not true that one part of the brain does reason and the other does emotion. Both are profoundly involved in both. It's not true that language resides only in the left hemisphere. It doesn't. Important aspects are in the right. It's not true that visual imagery is only in the right hemisphere. Lots of it is in the left. And so in a sort of fit of despair, people have given up talking about it. But the problem won't really go away, because this organ, which is all about making connection, is profoundly divided. It's there inside all of us, and it's got more divided over the course of human evolution. So that the ratio of the corpus callosum to the volume of the hemispheres has got smaller over evolution. And the plot thickens when you realize that one of the main, if not the main, function of the corpus callosum is in fact to inhibit the other hemisphere. So something very important is going on here about keeping things apart from one another. And not only that, the brain is profoundly asymmetric. It's broader at the back on the left and broader on the right at the front, and slightly juts forward and backward. And it's as though somebody got hold of the brain from underneath and given it a sort of sharp twist clockwise. What is all that about? If one just needed more brain space, one would do it symmetrically. The skull is symmetrical. The box in which all this is contained is symmetrical. Why go to trouble to expand some bits of one hemisphere and some bits of another, unless they were doing rather different things? What are they doing? Well, it's not just we who have these divided brains. Birds and animals have them as well.
I actually don't know what the exact date is going to be when I talk to him. I just know it's going to be somewhere in July and June. I'll post the details when I find out from Emo from them.
Of grit or pebbles. It's got to focus very narrowly and clearly on that little seed and be able to pick it out against that background. But it's also, if it's going to stay alive, it's got to actually keep a quite different kind of attention open. It's got to be on the lookout for predators or for friends, for conspecifics, but for whatever else is going on. Now, it seems that birds and animals quite reliably use their left hemisphere for this narrow focused attention to something it already knows is of importance to it. And they keep their right hemisphere vigilant broadly for whatever might be without any commitment as to what that might be. And they also use their right hemispheres for making connections with the world. So they approach their mates and bond with their mates more using the right hemisphere. But then you come to the humans. And it's true that actually in humans too, this kind of attention is one of the big differences. The right hemisphere gives sustained, broad, open vigilance, alertness, where the left hemisphere gives narrow, sharply focused attention to detail. And people who lose their right hemispheres have a pathological narrowing of the window of attention. But humans are different. The big thing about humans is their frontal lobes. And the purpose of that part of the brain? To inhibit the rest of the brain, to stop the immediate happening. So standing back in time and space from the immediacy of experience. And that enables us to do two things. It enables us to do what neuroscientists are always telling us we're very good at, which is outwitting the other party, being Machiavellian. And that's interesting to me, because that's absolutely right. We can read other people's minds and intentions, and if we so want to, we can deceive them. But the bit that's always curiously missed out here is that it also enables us to empathize for the first time, because there's a sort of necessary distance from the world. If you're right up against it, you just bite. But if you can stand back and see that other individual is an individual like me, who might have interests and values and feelings like mine, then you can make a bond. There's a sort of necessary distance, as there is in reading. Too close, you can't see anything. Too far, you can't read it. So the distance from the world that is provided is profoundly creative of all that is human, both the Machiavellian and the Erasmian. Now, to do the Machiavellian stuff, to manipulate the world, which is very important, we need to be able to interact with the world and use it for our benefit. Food is the starting point, but we also, with our left hemispheres, grasp, using our right hands, things and make tools. We also use that part of language to grasp things, as we say. It pins them down. So when we already know something's important and we want to be precise about it, we use our left hemispheres in that way. And to do that, we need a simplified version of reality. It's no good if you're fighting a campaign, having all the information on all the plant species that grow in the terrain of battle. What you need is to know the specifics of where certain things are that matter to you, and so you have a map and you have little flags. It's not reality, but it works better. The newness of the right hemisphere makes it a devil's advocate. It's always on the lookout for things that might be different from our expectations. It sees things in context. It understands implicit meaning, metaphor, body language, emotional expression in the face. It deals with an embodied world, in which we stand embodied in relation to a world that is concrete. It understands individuals, not just categories. It actually has a disposition for the living rather than the mechanical. And this is so marked that even in a left-hander who is actually using their right hemisphere in daily life to manipulate tools with their left hand, it is their left hemisphere, not their right hemisphere, in which tools and machines are coded. So this is very interesting. And it changes the view of the body. The body becomes an assemblage of parts in the left hemisphere. If I had to sum it all up, I would get away from all those things that we used to say, reason and imagination. Let me make it very clear. For imagination, you need both hemispheres. Let me make it very clear. For reason, you need both hemispheres. So if I had to sum it up, I'd say the world of the left hemisphere, dependent on denotative language and abstraction, yields clarity and power to manipulate things that are known, fixed, static, isolated, decontextualized, explicit, general in nature, but ultimately lifeless. The right hemisphere, by contrast, yields a world of individual, changing, evolving, interconnected, implicit, incarnate, living beings within the context of the lived world, but in the nature of things never fully graspable, never perfectly known. And to this world it exists in a certain relationship. The knowledge that's mediated by the left hemisphere is, however, within a closed system. It has the advantage of perfection, but the perfection is bought ultimately at the price of emptiness. There's a problem here about the nature of the two worlds. They offer us two versions of the world, and obviously we combine them in different ways all the time. We need to rely on certain things to manipulate the world, but for a broad understanding of it, we need to use knowledge that comes from the right hemisphere. And it's my suggestion to you that in the history of Western culture, things started in the 6th century BC, in the Augustan era, and in the 15th, 16th century in Europe, with a wonderful balancing of these hemispheres. But in each case, it drifted further to the left hemisphere's point of view. Nowadays, we live in a world which is paradoxical. We pursue happiness, and it leads to resentment, and it leads to unhappiness, and it leads, in fact, to an explosion of mental illness. We've pursued freedom, but we now live in a world which is more monitored by CCTV cameras, and in which our daily lives are more subjected to what de Tocqueville called a network of small, complicated rules that cover the surface of life and strangle freedom. More information, we have it in spades, but we get less and less able to use it, to understand it, to be wise. There's a paradoxical relationship, as I know as a psychiatrist, between adversity and fulfillment, between restraint and freedom, between the knowledge of the parts and wisdom about the whole. It's the machine model again that is supposed to answer everything, but it doesn't. Think about this. Even rationality is grounded in a leap of intuition. There is no way you can rationally prove that rationality is a good way to look at the world. We intuit that it is very helpful. And this is not new. At the other end of the process, rationality we know from Gödel's theorem, we know from what Pascal was saying hundreds of years before Gödel, that the end point of rationality is to demonstrate the limits to rationality. In our modern world, we've developed something that looks awfully like the left hemisphere's world. We prioritize the virtual over the real. The technical becomes important. Bureaucracy flourishes. The picture, however, is fragmented. There's a lot of uniqueness. The how has become subsumed in what. And the need for control leads to a paranoia in society that we need to govern and control everything. Why this shift? I think there are three reasons. One is the left hemisphere's talk is very convincing because it shaved everything that it doesn't find fits with its model off and cut it out. So this particular model is entirely self-consistent, largely because it's made itself so. I also call the left hemisphere the Berlusconi of the brain, because it controls the media. It's the one with which it's very vocal on its own behalf. The right hemisphere doesn't have a voice, and it can't construct these same arguments. And I also think, rather more importantly, there's a sort of hall of mirrors effect. The more we get trapped into this, the more we undercut and ironize things that might have led us out of it, and we just get reflected back into more of what we know about what we know about what we know. And I just want to make it clear, I'm not against whatever it is the left hemisphere has to offer. Nobody could be more passionate in an age in which we neglect reason and we neglect careful use of language. Nobody could be more passionate than myself about language and about reason. It's just that I'm even more passionate about the right hemisphere and the need to return what that knows to a broader context. It turned out that Einstein's thinking somehow presaged this thing about the structure of the brain. He said, the intuitive mind is a sacred gift, and the rational mind is a faithful servant. We have created a society that honors the servant, but has forgotten the gift.
So that was an old RSA animate video that Ian McGilchrist, I guess, got helped by, made by someone else. I don't know who it exactly was that made it, but that was definitely his voice. I think that was made around like 2012, 2011. I read his book in about 2014, 2013, fell in love with it. And and actually is responsible for a large set of my views and a big chunk of why I started doing philosophy. So the person in charge of his meetings and you know, various exchanges kind of graced me with the idea, or graced me with a time slot within June, July right now that we're kind of working out still, for where I can talk to him and hopefully discuss some of the ideas that he has. Alongside all of these types of ideas with the left and right hemisphere, he's also a process ontologist. I believe, although he's never said it word for word, he's a panentheist like I am. I think that he has probably a lot of the similar types of views that I have, because his favorite philosopher is also my favorite philosopher, which is Friedrich Schelling. So it wouldn't, I wouldn't doubt that we have a lot of similarities there that we can definitely go through and sort of discuss in depth. Anyways, guys, thank you for joining me once again. Hopefully you guys enjoyed the stream. My next one will be probably whenever that's going to be. It might be a little bit, it might be earlier, or sorry, later this month, in the midst of this month, which would be earlier, but it could be all the way up to, you know, late July. But yeah, thanks for joining me, at least for now. Until next time, guys.